Chapter 5:12. Yesterday, I went for a physical examination. The results will be out next week. Everything I know is fine, but my blood pressure is very high. It's 110 to 150. Both the doctor and myself were shocked. It's probably a problem caused by my evil writing work. Today, my blood pressure is much better. Everyone should exercise more and pay attention to their diet. Don't always sit in front of the computer reading and playing games. Your health is still the most important. In the mountain pavilion, the smile on the Northern Qi Emperor's face suddenly disappeared. He returned to his usual silence when he was alone. He had grown up in the royal palace. When his father first passed away, he faced the most difficult test of his life. Although, with the powerful support of imperial advisor Ku He, the Empress Dowager had carried him through this difficult time, such a beginning meant that his life as an emperor would not be smooth. There were many reasons for it not being smooth, but the most important one was the secret hidden in his heart, in the Empress Dowager's heart, and in imperial advisor Ku He's hearts that could never be spoken of. For this secret, the Northern Qi Emperor had made too many sacrifices and made too many changes that twisted his personality. He could not have too close a relationship with too many people. He could not be too intimate with his sisters. He could not be impudent and do whatever he wanted. In these dozen years, the people at his side had never changed. Even when he showered, it was as if he was facing a great enemy. The secondary concubines in the back palace still had hidden bitterness. In order to divert the Qin kingdom's attention and make the officials in court more alert, he and his mother had acted out the scene of mother and son not being in harmony for so many years. It had been very difficult. He didn't want to shoulder all this, but since he had already shouldered it, as a descendant of the Zhan family, he had inherited his grandfather's ambition and will to shake the world. He had to play his role well. It had to be admitted that he had done well these years. No one could find too many faults with the little emperor. He had condoned and even secretly lured Shang Shanhu to kill Shen Zhong on a rainy night, seized the Shen family, and firmly controlled the entire brocade guard in the hands of the royal family. He had put Shang Shanhu under house arrest for a year to reduce his drive, and then released him to suppress the overbearing Qing army in the south. Within the country, he had suppressed the tyrants and colluded with Fan Xian outside the country. One trick after another was used. These 2 years, the Northern Qi court had become more and more orderly under his management. In particular, the Jiangnan matter proved the young emperor's deep foresight and scheming. Even if the person in charge of the Jiangnan palace treasury was not Fan Xian, presumably he still had the ability to secretly obtain some benefits. The Northern Qi emperor knew that there were many levels of benefit. No matter how he imagined it, he had never thought that he could obtain so many benefits for his court through Fan Xian. He gently patted the railing and looked at the clear, flowing water in the mountain stream. He sighed and softly said to himself, "But why did you come? What right do you have to give all the benefits to me?" A cold and mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. The illegitimate son of the Qing emperor, how different can he be from his father? During the time he had spent learning to become an emperor, the only person the Northern Qi emperor could find in the present world was the powerful ruler of the Qing kingdom. He knew that his peer, who was a generation older than him, was a powerful figure who had great ambitions but was also good at enduring silently. In the end, you will grow old, and you are already old. The Northern Qi emperor furrowed his brows slightly. His gaze turned slightly and gazed toward the distant south. Thinking of the recent battle in the Qing kingdom royal family, he quietly said, "Even if you were a lion in the past and fought until the Wei kingdom fell apart and the Qi kingdom struggled at death's door, you are, after all, old. Your entire being emanates a sense of decay. I truly hope that you can continue to rot sinisterly like this and force him to come to me." These words seemed to sigh at every detail of history and seemed to increase his own confidence. Everyone knew that no matter how sensitive and suspicious the Qing emperor was, history only believed in history itself. Past history had already proven that the Qing emperor was the only victor in the world these 30 years. The northern Qi emperor narrowed his eyes. The corners of his lips twitched slightly. He muttered to himself, "I hope you can survive this time and allow me to openly defeat you on this stage of the world." He didn't quite understand Fan Xian. In reality, Fan Xian could not see him clearly either. As an emperor, no matter what color his heart was, his first consideration was his throne and the world. If his relationship with Fan Xian could always maintain peace and mutual benefits, the northern Qi emperor would not hesitate to fulfill Fan Xian's requests at all costs, such as Haitang and Fan Ruoro's acceptance as a teacher. In the future, if Fan Xian threatened northern Qi, the northern Qi emperor would coldly and mercilessly use all the power at his disposal to eliminate Fan Xian. It had nothing to do with emotions, country, or gender. In this world, there were only 3 kinds of people: men, women, and emperors. The water in the stream below the pavilion flowed down the mountain until it reached the side of the group of palaces at the bottom of the mountain. At the foot of the mountain, it formed a pool of clear water. To the west of the clear water was a small gap made of white stone. The gurgling clear water flowed out through the gap, but it did not stir the pool at all. In the forest behind the pool of clear water, there was a large group of eunuchs and serving girls waiting with their heads lowered and quiet. No one knew that the emperor was in a daze in the pavilion halfway up the mountain. They only knew that the 2 most noble people in all of northern Qi, other than the emperor, were in a daze by the pool of water. Dressed in hemp garments and wearing a straw hat, imperial advisor Ku He was barefooted. He looked like an ascetic monk. He was sitting on a rock by the side of the pond, holding a fishing rod in his hand. The northern Qi Empress Dowager, who had put in a great deal of effort and endured a great deal of power and chaos in order for her son to sit firmly on the throne, smiled slightly as she sat by Master Ku He's side. Her brows were filled with peace and serenity. Back then, the Zhan family had risen from the chaos of the world and forcefully inherited the Wei Kingdom's heavenly treasure through military power. However, there had been endless years of war. Countless brave generals in the royal family had all lost their lives to the Qing emperor's ruthless and ferocious attack. After the Zhan emperor died of illness, only she and the northern Qi emperor, an orphan and a widow, were left in the entire palace. At that time, the Qing kingdom's Chen Pingping was in power. The northern court's political situation was in turmoil. The nobles were all clamoring, and the situation in the palace was precarious. Even under such circumstances, this woman still allowed her son to sit firmly on the throne. Most importantly, it was the imperial advisor's unyielding stance by her side. At the same time, it also proved that this Empress Dowager was not as mediocre as she appeared on the surface. Ku He's eyes calmly watched the unruffled surface of the water. The Empress Dowager smiled slightly. She thought of the changes in Shangjing this year. Back then, there had been changes in the palace. She had Chang Ningho risk his life to leave the palace and beg Shenzhong to bring people to help. Shenzhong and the brocade guard had performed a great service. However, the emperor had grown up and could not tolerate Shenzhong continuing to be arrogant, so he had an idea. The Empress Dowager felt guilty toward Shenzhong, but her son's mind was made up. She knew she could not persuade him, so she silently allowed this matter to happen. The people of the Zhan family seemed to always be stubborn and could not be changed by other people, such as her son or the person beside her. However, she still wanted to continue trying. Last night, the northern Qi emperor had talked with her for a long night and felt that this matter was not as beautiful as he had imagined. He had asked her to persuade imperial advisor Ku He. Thus, there had been today's greetings by the pond. "I've never seen Li Yunrui. We've only exchanged a lot of secret letters," the northern Qi Empress Dowager said gently. In front of Ku He, she would not call herself I. Although her expression was still dignified, her tone was like that of a little girl who did not understand much. He smiled and said, "The three countries are separated by a great distance." When Zhuang Mohan was invited to the south, he did not see the face of the eldest princess. The Empress Dowager sighed and said, "As a result, Master Zhuang was left with a lifetime of regret." He shook his head. "But I have seen the eldest princess, so I know that she is not a simple woman. The change in Jingdo in the southern court this time happened so quickly. There was no movement at all. It is truly beyond my expectations." What do means is. The Empress Dowager thought for a moment and then said, "When two countries clash, it is still a battle of national power. It is better not to take risk. Why didn't he come and speak to me personally?" He smiled slightly. "The child is still young. He probably does not understand why we old people are still so cautious when the Qing Emperor has been a mess these years." He continued, "Because I know, and you also know, that the Qing Emperor is truly not a normal person. In the second generation, a great grandmaster did not appear, but an emperor who used troops like a god." His brows furrowed. "The longer he endured, the more uneasy I felt." The Northern Qi Empress Dowager sighed and said, "Even so, there is no good way." The old man smiled and took off his straw hat, revealing his large bald head. "Happily," he said, "I remember that Yi Luyun also likes to wear a hat and run all over the world. If even such a person can be used by Li Yunrui, I believe that the eldest princess will think of a way." Now that the topic had reached this point, the Empress Dowager knew that she could no longer persuade the imperial advisor to change his mind. Respectfully, she said, "Uncle, let's watch a bit longer. Let the Qing court mess around on their own. It will always be good for us. There's not much time left." The fishing rod in He's hand did not tremble at all. Slowly, he said, "If we old people cannot solve this problem while we are alive, who will solve it in the future?" These words were exactly the same as what the great grandmaster in the grass hut had said. The Empress Dowager's hand trembled slightly. She smiled and said, "What about Haidang? Besides, there is still Fan Xian in the south." He smiled and said, "Fan Xian, this young man will have to depend on his luck. If he is smart and powerful enough, presumably he will obtain the greatest benefit in this matter. It can be considered a gift from our court. Given this young man's nature, since he has received such a great favor from Lil Pi, he will always think of Northern Qi in the future." When all was said and done, these people in power in Northern Qi knew that in terms of national power, Northern Qi, which had been accumulating problems for a long time, could not catch up to or surpass the Qing kingdom in a short period of time. In the grand scheme of things, within a dozen years, the Qing kingdom would still be the main attacker and Northern Qi the main defender. "I had thought that the crown prince of the Qing court or the second prince had a better chance," the Empress Dowager said with a frown. He shook his head. "Fan Xian is such a murderous and fearful person. How could he give them a chance to ascend? If there really was such a possibility, do you think he would be unwilling to kill? In this entire world, there are not many people who can survive Fan Xian's murderous intent." The Empress Dowager was slightly surprised. She had not thought that the imperial advisor's evaluation of Fan Xian's strength would be so powerful. "Don't forget, there is still a blind man behind him. Yi Luyun cannot be the bodyguard of the Qing princes." He smiled and raised the fishing rod in his hand. A thin line was tied to the rod. He was not like some people who used a rope to fish senselessly in order to reach the realm of Dogsh*T. The fishing hook came out of the water. A few drops of clear beads fell back into the water. This pool of clear water in the royal palace seemed to be excited by these drops of clear beads. With a splash, the water rippled, causing the green water plants at the bottom of the pool to sway helplessly. Countless fish with golden or green tails leaped out of the water happily and slapped the surface of the water. It seemed to be expressing gratitude to the ascetic monk holding the fishing rod in his hand. the sound of the water gradually quieted. It flowed out of the gap in the clear pool, forming a white jade that moistened half the hill. It flowed out of the palace walls and merged into the Yuchuan River. The stream in the palace was only a tributary of the Yuchuan River. In reality, the Yuchuan River's name came from the stream on the Green Mountain in the royal palace. The Yuchuan. The Yuchuan River flowed into Shangjing. Not far from the palace walls, it passed a garden. This was Haitong's garden. To find peace and quiet in Shangjing's bustling area was a rare and good place. In the past, Fan Xian had mocked her for being obsessed with fame. He had not thought that this kind of garden was secretly full of nobility. There was not a hint of the countryside at all. At this moment, two girls walked out of the garden. They boarded the carriage outside the garden and headed into the city. It did not take long for the carriage to reach the busiest part of Shangjing. The speed of the carriage slowed. As it passed an antique shop, the driver seemed to hear the call of the girl in the carriage and stopped. Haitang put down her right hand that had pulled up the curtain and turned her head to Fan Ruoro. "It's your brother. Do you want to go down and say hello?" Fan Ruoro smiled and said, "Since he's treating today, let's not see him early. Let's walk around Shangjing first." Haitang nodded. The carriage began to move again without disturbing the people in the antique shop. Inside the antique shop, a slightly plump young man was looking at the goods inside with his head down. This person was none other than the second young master of the Fan family, who had been kicked to Shangjing by Fan Xian. He had suffered countless hardships at Haitong's hands and finally made it out. He had taken over the Chui family's northern route, Fan Sidu. Perhaps it was because he had changed his appearance or because the life away from home had made this young man mature early. At this moment, his countenance was completely calm. There was no trace of the arrogance and ruthlessness of the past. It made people think he was much more mature than his true age. Tonight, he was holding a large banquet in the Shangjing branch of Baoyue brothel. He knew ahead of time that his sister and Haitang, the two people he feared the most, were coming, so he had come out early to buy gifts from the antique shop. He had to make sure that these two were happy. However, after looking for a long time and even having the shop owner bring out all the goods from his collection, he still did not find anything satisfactory. This made his mood a bit unhappy. Behind him were still the northern Chi aces and bodyguards with curved knives at their waist. Although the Fan brothers knew that this was definitely a group of people monitored by the northern Chi royal family, Fan Xizha was as daring as Fan Xian. He continued to use them casually and did not change them out. There were other people looking at the goods in the shop. From the color of their clothing, one could see that they were either wealthy or of high status. This antique shop was very famous, and the goods sold were also very expensive. Thus, the people who dared to come in and pick out items were all important figures in northern Qi. If they were not wealthy merchants, then they were nobles. These people did not recognize Fan Xizha, but seeing that he had brought 4 ace guards with him, they secretly guessed that this young man must be the son of some family that did not like to show off. At this moment, the shop owner walked in with a very solemn expression, carrying a wooden tray covered by a red cloth. He moved closer to Fan Xizha's side and said, "Young master, if you want a pair, then this is the only one." Fan Xizha lifted a corner of the red cloth and saw that on the tray was a pair of jade lions. The carving was excellent. The lions had the heads of tigers and were exceptionally cute. He couldn't help but smile. He thought that giving this pair to his sister and Haitang was indeed appropriate. It also had the intention of helping him vent some anger. "This is it." He waved his hand. Unfortunately, the nobles looking at the goods to the side also had their eyes on this pair of jade lions. They begged Fan Xizha to raise his hand and let them go. A rich young master was even willing to give a red packet to show his sincerity. In large places like Shangjing, Jingdou, and Dongyi, there were usually not many situations where people relied on power to steal goods. After all, everyone present was either wealthy or of high status. No one knew who they would offend. In Shangjing, Fan Xizhi had always kept a low profile. The Qing kingdom's wanted posters still had his name. Other than the brocade guards, the Qing royal family, and related officials, not many people knew his true identity. If this had been in the past, Fan Xizhi might have agreed to such a gentle request from this rich young master. However, he truly liked this pair of jade lions, so he hesitated and did not speak. With this hesitation, the mood of the nobles became unhappy. They thought that they had already given him enough face. If the Marquis had not been invited to an important gathering and given the matter of buying gifts to the young master, they would not have needed this pair of precious jade lions as gifts. Why would they have to speak to this stranger? The people parted. A 12 or 13-year-old nobleman walked out. Pointing at Fan Xizhi's nose, he cursed, "In Shangjing, no one dares to fight with me for things." Fan Xizhi furrowed his brows. If this had been in the past, he would probably have thrown out a punch long ago. As he grew older, his temperament was much more stable. He asked, "You are?" Someone kindly reminded him, "This is the young master of the Marquis of Chang'an's family." The Marquis of Chang'an and the Marquis of Changningho were the brothers of the Northern Qi Empress Dowager. This status was indeed sufficiently noble. After Fan Xizhi paused slightly, he laughed hatefully. "Your father wants to give a gift tonight, right?" No matter how much Fan Xizhi had improved, he was, after all, a lawless person in the past. Gritting his teeth, he stared fiercely into the child's eyes and said, "Little brat." After these words were said, the people in front of them all surrounded them. The crowd was ferocious and seemed ready to attack. Fan Xizhi laughed coldly and led the 4 scimitar guards out of the antique shop. In the carriage outside, a strange light flashed through the eyes of a scimitar guard. He asked Fan Xizhi, "Boss, do you know that young master?" Fan Xizhi spat and cursed, "That little brat. Back then, Big Brother broke his arm, yet he hasn't improved at all. If he dares to provoke me again, I would have broken his other arm." Inside the antique shop, everyone looked at each other. They thought that the guy earlier was very daring to call the young master of the Marquis of Chang'an a little brat to his face. Without further ado, the young master picked the gift and forcefully suppressed his anger. Happily, he returned to his manor and followed his father to the Baoyue brothel branch in Shangjing that had opened less than 4 months ago. He was ready to participate in this important gathering. When he entered the building and sat beside his father, he looked at the fat man sitting at the head of the table chatting cheerfully with his cousin. He was immediately dumbfounded. His cousin was called Wei Hua. He was the most outstanding young man in the entire Wei family. Presently, he was deeply appreciated by the emperor and held the important position of commander of the provost of the brocade guard. In all of northern Qi, he had terrifying power. However, such a powerful figure was, at this moment, chatting freely with the chubby young man like they had been friends for many years. There seemed to be a faint wariness between his brows. The young master of the Marquis of Chang'an watched this scene in a daze. He thought to himself, "The chubby brother who called me a little brat earlier, who exactly was he?" While Fan Xizhi and Wei Hua were talking, he glanced below the table from the corner of his eyes and found that Marquis of Chang'an had brought his good-for-nothing son. He thought to himself, "That old thing is already so old. How could he have such a young son? Don't tell me he's wearing a hat," as he criticized silently. He smiled at Marquis of Chang'an and greeted him. Today's banquet was initiated by him. He did not invite outsiders. Everyone was a member of the Northern Qi royal family. The purpose was also very simple. The news from the Qing court was clear that Li Yunrui had already fallen. It seemed that there was no one within the Qing kingdom that could threaten his brother. Thus, he had to grasp this opportunity and expand the scope of his business. Doing business with Northern Qi was actually doing business with the Northern Qi Emperor's family. Thus, he had invited everyone in the Wei family. At the same time, he had asked Haitang and his sister to help him suppress the situation. What was Fan Sijia afraid of? All of the low-priced goods in the south were in his hands. The products of the palace treasury were endlessly delivered to his hands by Xia Mingji. If the Wei family wanted to get rich, they had to rely on him. Chapter 513. My condition is SOSO. Charging my laptop keeps tripping at home. I am very annoyed. Sorry. The banquet proceeded smoothly, at least on the surface, particularly after Fan Sijia accepted the pair of jade lions from Marquis Chang and with a false smile. However, as the host, Fan Sijia habitually glanced out of the hall of Baoyue brothel. He had reserved the entire Baoyue brothel, so there were no other guests. Sitting beside him, Wei Hua furrowed his brows slightly and wondered who else was coming. Why hadn't he received any news beforehand? Looking at Fan Sijia's expression, one could imagine that the identity of the guests who were about to arrive was not low. Otherwise, he would not be unable to suppress his anticipation and nervousness. If the identity of the guests was not low, why had the banquet begun before the guests arrived? Wei Hua unconsciously shook his head. A self-mocking and bitter smile rose to the corners of his lips. He knew that he could not use common sense to judge these two brothers of the Fan family. He was now the commander of the provost of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard. He had taken over Xin Zhong's former position. Most of Northern Qi's special forces were under his control. The little Northern Qi Emperor's trust in him could not be said to be weak. His power could not be said to be small. However, once he faced the Fan brothers from the south, Wei Hua still felt faintly nervous. Fan Xian was in charge of the Overwatch Council. He and Wei Hua were in the same line of business. However, Wei Hua knew that he had not delved into this line of work as long as Fan Xian had. The Northern Court's Brocade Guard also did not have as much power as the Southern Court's Overwatch Council. If the two of them actually fought across the border, he would not be a match for the other. As for Fan Sijia, Wei Hua looked at the chubby young man beside him who was entertaining the guests and furrowed his brows slightly. He had to admit that he had indeed misjudged this person 2 years ago. He had thought that Fan Xian was just using the power in his hands to send his brother to Northern Qi to escape. He had not thought that after a year, Fan Sijia, hidden behind the scenes, had firmly controlled the old Shui family's routes. His secret business was also flourishing. This was completely not the business sensitivity and ability a young man should have. Wei Hua slapped his forehead. Smiling, he toasted Fan Sijia and cracked a few jokes. The purpose of Fan Sijia's invitation today was clear. The smuggled goods from the south had to be taken over by someone. They couldn't let a Qing man openly sell them in Northern Qi. In the past, it had always been the Wei clan, especially Chang Ningho, who had taken over. Now that Fan Sijia was becoming more and more daring, he felt that Chang Ningho's family was moving too slowly. That was why he had dragged Chang Anho in as well. Wei Hua did not dislike this arrangement. It was not because the Marquis of Chang'an was his uncle. Rather, he knew that the Wei family was just a puppet the emperor had placed in front of the stage. The majority of the profits flowed endlessly into the emperor's internal treasury through this business. Furthermore, no matter how much trouble Fan Sijia could cause, he was, after all, on Northern Qi territory. Wei Hua had enough power to keep an eye on him. Once things went wrong, the Brocade Guard could easily clean out all of Fan Sijia's businesses. It was just that Wei Hua wouldn't dare to do such a thing until things had reached the final step. He didn't even dare to ask for an imperial edict. Northern Qi needed the goods Fan Xian had spat out from the Qing palace treasury. Wei Hua was afraid of Fan Xian's sinister methods and his unreasonableness. The curtain at Baoyue brothel's door moved slightly. 2 girls entered together. Wei Hua's hand holding the wine cup shook and almost spilled it. He knew the 2 girls. This was also one of the reasons why Wei Hua had always been deeply afraid of Fan Xian. Haitang and Fan Ruoro. Wei Hua stood to welcome them. He turned around and pretended to scold Fanxia a few times before inviting the two noble disciples of Tianyi Dao to sit at the main table. For a moment the scene was awkward. Everyone in northern Qi knew that the Empress Dowager's intention was for Haitang to marry Wei Hua. However, Haitang and Fan Xian had some unclear relationship. Wei Hua laughed bitterly and said to Haitang, "Second young Master Fan is inviting us. You really don't give me any face by coming like this." Haitang smiled and took the jade lion Fanxia handed to her. She fiddled with it and said, "You just like to talk." Wei Hua laughed and didn't say anything more. From a long time ago, he knew that this woman was not someone he could touch. When the Empress Dowager had first shown interest, the first thing he did was enter the palace to decline. However, it didn't have much effect. The Empress Dowager's love for her juniors was always unreasonable. The Empress Dowager was unreasonable, Fan Xian was unreasonable, and Wei Hua did not have the courage. This matter offended Fan Xian too much. Besides, if he married a ninth-level ace, how could he maintain his authority? Besides, although Haitang was intelligent, her looks were very average. Last year, Wei Hua's sister had followed Lang Tiao to Jiangnan. When they passed through Wuzhou, they had gotten into an argument. Wei Hua knew Fan Xian's petty personality and that he must be holding a grudge. He had no choice but to write a letter and say many good things before Fan Xian's anger subsided. As his thoughts drifted through the years, Wei Hua couldn't help but sigh. "Fan Xian, Fan Xian, you don't give me any face at all. You always push yourself down on everything. We are in the same line, so why are you in such a rush to destroy each other?" As the commander of the Brocade Guard, why was he not as happy as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Ever since Haitang and Fan Ruoro entered Baoyue Brothel, the banquet in the hall became much quieter. The shrewd and ruthless elders of the Wei family put on the airs of elders and chatted with the two girls. In their hearts, they were thinking that they had originally wanted to help the emperor get more benefits in this negotiation. Now that these two had arrived, particularly Haitang, where were her arms and elbows born? Thus, their attacks on Fanxia slowed down. Fanxia's expression was calm as he spoke with a slight smile. In their casual conversation, he clearly explained the division of profits in the coming year and the details of the handover. He had Haitang and her sister come today to give himself a bargaining chip. At least, he wanted to mess up the hearts of the northern Qi people. Nominally, it was his negotiation with the Wei family. In reality, although not everyone at the banquet knew about Fan Xian and the northern Qi emperor's shady dealings, Chang Ningho and his son, who led the Wei family, knew. After 3 rounds of wine, the discussion ended. Both sides parted happily. However, Wei Hua's expression was not very happy. It was clear that in this new round of agreement on dividing the spoils, Fanxia had still taken the lion's share. The night gradually darkened. Haitang held the warm jade lion and glanced at Fanxia with a not quite there smile. She then left, leaving Baoyue Brothel to the siblings. "I don't like Haitang," Fanxia said with a furrowed brows in a room in the Jingdo branch of Baoyue Brothel. "You're becoming more and more old and heavy." Fan Ruoro patted her brother's head out of habit and smiled slightly. "What's wrong with sister? Don't tell me you still hold a grudge against me for using you like a donkey?" Fanxia shook his head and said, "That was brother's intention. He wanted me to suffer. I understand." Fan Ruoro looked at her brother with some surprise. Tilting her head, she said, "You're truly becoming more and more old. You're not like a child at all." Fanxia smiled self-mockingly and said, "In a place like this, there's no one I can trust. There's nothing I can do if I don't want to be careful. Right, sister? You said old." His spirit suddenly rose and he asked, "Are you saying that I'm becoming more and more like brother?" Fanxia asked excitedly. In his heart, his older brother was his life's idol. If he could get closer to his older brother's image, naturally, he would be more pleased. Fan Ruoro covered her smile and said, "You're becoming more and more like father. It looks like father's beating you back then did have some effect." She paused and then said, "Earlier, you said you didn't like Sister Haitang. Why?" Fan Xizha looked quietly into his sister's eyes and didn't speak for a moment. Fan Ruoro also looked at him calmly. "Sister, you should understand," Fan Xizha said seriously. "We already have a sister-in-law." Fan Ruoro's brows also furrowed. She sighed and said, "Yes." Fan Xizha furrowed his brows and thought for a moment. In a quiet voice, he said, "Actually, you don't even know that during this year, sister-in-law has written me many letters." Fan Ruoro was slightly startled and asked, "What did she say in the letters?" "What could she say? It's just how the family is, how father is, and how mother is." Fan Xizha sighed. "My brother-in-law is alone in a foreign country. Of course, sister-in-law is worried. To tell the truth, during this year, whenever I have something I don't understand, I don't want to go and trouble brother. It's all sister-in-law who helped me think of ideas." Fan Ruoro gradually digested the shock in her heart. This was also the first time she had heard of this matter. She thought about it for a moment and tasted many flavors. She sadly said, "Sister-in-law is a very pitiful person. As you know, the eldest princess is currently imprisoned by the emperor in a side courtyard, and brother is in Jiangnan. Brother only knows how to kick me to the north." Fan Xizha's tone carried dissatisfaction. Fan Xizha sounded dissatisfied. "Even though I know he's training me, has he ever thought about how young I am? Such a big mess, how could I manage it? I only know how to let go. How could I be as thorough as you think?" Fan Ruoro furrowed her brows and scolded, "It's not easy for brother in the south. If it wasn't for him standing firm, how could you stand firm in the north? How is he letting go? The shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall are all secretly helping you. The Overwatch Council's network in northern Qi is also serving you. In order to raise you, he has put a lot of effort. As for training, it's not like you don't know what kind of person brother is. He grew up alone in Danzhou. I don't know what kind of person he has gone through to get to where he is today. This is what he believes in. This is how he treats himself. We are his brothers and sisters. Of course, he would also choose this method." After a string of scoldings, it was as if Fan Xizha had returned to Jingdo a few years ago. At that time, he, who was not afraid of heaven or earth, was only afraid of the iron ruler in his sister's hand. In an instant, he softened. A moment later, he muttered, "In any case, I don't like Haitang." Fan Ruoro sighed and said, "It's not like you don't know how much Haitang has helped brother in secret. It's just an exchange of benefits. Other than the dead Zhuang Mohan, how many people in northern Qi are truly saints who do not care about worldly matters?" Fan Xizha smiled coldly. "Don't look at how you've entered Ku He's tutelage, and how I'm the #1 boss. If brother is no longer useful to northern Qi, I'm afraid we will immediately be stepped on. At that time, I don't expect Haitang to stick up for us." Fan Ruoro said seriously, "My view is the opposite of yours." Fan Xizha shook his head and faintly said a moment later, "No matter what, there has to be a first come, first served, right?" Fan Ruoro thought deeply for a long time and slowly nodded. She also felt great pity for her respectable and amiable sister-in-law, who was used to being silent and hurt. She agreed with her brother's view. Suddenly, an absurd thought welled up in her heart. If it was said first come, first served, shouldn't she be the first to reach brother's side? It was just that fate played tricks on her. A trace of bitterness rose to the corner of her lips. Shortly after, she suppressed this undeserved emotion and worried with her brother about Lin Wan-er's fate. Brother is definitely not someone who is fickle and indifferent. It's just that now, sister-in-law is stuck between the eldest princess and brother. She really doesn't know what to do. Don't think so much. Fan Xizha shrugged. Right now, the most important problem is brother's situation in the south. I saw that you had a large banquet tonight and thought you'd already forgotten yourself. The eldest princess has fallen. Naturally, I have to use this opportunity to earn more money, Fantasia said. But right now, only brother's faction is powerful in the court. I just feel that there will be some problems. Perhaps you're thinking too far ahead. It's not exactly powerful, but it's standing at the edge of the wind. Fanruoro smiled slightly. Regardless of whether it's family affairs or national affairs, it doesn't seem to be something that people like us who are guests in a foreign land can worry about. Fantasia was startled. Given his sister's usual attitude, he thought, she should be very worried about Fan Xian's safety. Why did she appear so indifferent? But he didn't dare to criticize his sister. He unconsciously asked, "Whose poem, brother? Didn't he compose a poem?" He doesn't do it in front of outsiders. We really don't care. What can we worry about? Fanruoro's calm expression carried a sense of confidence in her brother. He works so hard to send us to Northern Qi because he doesn't want us to be involved in these matters. If we really want to do what's best for him, then we must live well here and not make him worry. How do you live well? Is it happy being a boss? It's okay, although sometimes it's a bit troublesome. I'm going to the medical shop tomorrow. I also feel that this kind of life is very happy. Brother said that people live in this world to find things they like to do. Chapter 514. June 1st, I wish everyone a happy holiday. A new month is a new beginning. Looking back at last month, it was truly a series of difficult things. This story is also very difficult. My condition has entered the worst period. I have held on, but there are still a few chapters that were poorly written, including yesterday's chapter. I am truly sorry. I am satisfied with the chapters before and after the thunderstorm, but I still have some regrets. In my original fantasies, I should have written better. I should have been able to do better, so I continue to apologize. I don't know how much I can write this month, because it really is something. I will do my best to ensure that it is at least 130,000 word. Last month, I took third place in the monthly vote. This is my best ranking since I posted my book online. I received a total of 6,000 yuan in prize money. I sincerely thank everyone for your support. Please continue to support the lazy but serious me. Thank you. From Jiangnan Road to Jiangbei Road, there were 3 convenient routes. No matter which one they took, they would always have to cross the mighty river. In the present world, there were no concrete bridges that Fan Xian was familiar with. There was only the endless stream of ferries between the two sides to support the busy waterside traffic. The 3 large workshops of the palace treasury were in North Min, the transport company Yamen was in Suzhou, and Sir Fan Jr. was in Hangzhou. It appeared that the palace treasury's control was loose. Only the officials and merchants who had the opportunity to come into contact with this portion of the palace treasury knew how strict the control over the warehouses and special routes throughout Jiangnan was after the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury Yamen worked together. In particular, the route to the north purposely took a turn to the west. From Shazhou it crossed the river to the north, then crossed the barren mountains of Jiangbei Road, the meadows of Tsangzhou Road, and then circled around the North Sea. It endlessly sent into northern Qi territory and brought back rich silver for the Qin kingdom to purchase other needs. Most of the goods heading north were under Xia Mingji's control. With Fan Xian's help, Xia Qifei placed a few large bids and secretly consolidated the small businesses and gangs in the Jiangnan area. He had gradually become powerful. In the eyes of the officials, the reason he chose to cross the river in Shazhou was because the Jiangnan Navy was stationed there. Only Fan Xian and he knew that Shazhou was chosen because the Jiangnan water bandits had the strongest power there. Although the palace treasury goods could be sent by the court to supervise the delivery, the things inside could not be trusted to let the court watch them all. Xia Qifei sat in a tea shop outside the city gate of Shazhou. While drinking tea, He looked at the ships transporting goods on the smooth river and narrowed his eyes slightly. The second young master in the north suddenly increased his appetite for goods, but it was not to the extent that he could not accept them. After all, the doors of the palace treasury were completely open to Fan Xian's trusted aides. However, to send all the goods there in such a short amount of time, and at the same time not raise the court's suspicions, required careful planning. Fortunately, according to court practice, the Overwatch Council was responsible for supervising the operation of the palace treasury. Now, the worries of the officials in the court had finally become reality. Fan Xian monitored himself. How could there not be a problem? Xia Qifei put down the teacup and slowly savored the bitter taste in his mouth. However, there was not a trace of bitterness in his heart. Looking back on this year and a half, he sometimes felt like he was dreaming. Ever since he climbed onto the imperial envoy's thigh, the family grudge that had bitten his heart for over a decade like a poisonous snake had been resolved in one day. The Ming family had once again returned to his hands. His identity had also changed from the shady head of the Jiangnan water bandits to an official of the Overwatch Council and a wealthy merchant whose name shook Jiangnan. The matters of this world were indeed somewhat wondrous. However, he also knew that the present Ming family was no longer the Ming family of the past. Although the court had not directly interfered, if Sir Fan Jr. truly gave the order, he could only follow it completely. Thinking of this, he pulled back his satisfied gaze from the boxes of goods in the boats on the river and furrowed his brows slightly. There were some things he did not understand. Smuggling palace treasury goods to northern Qi and Dongyi was, without question, the most profitable business in the world. Given Sir Fan Jr.'s identity, why was he so greedy? Sir Fan Jr. had once explained that the reason the eldest princess was greedy for silver was because she wanted to seek power in court, pave the foundations for the princes, and buy people's hearts in the military. However, Sir Fan Jr. was a prince. After he returned to the Fan family, it was impossible for him to take over the throne. What did he need so much silver for? Furthermore, the emperor had not liked the eldest princess secretly emptying out his palace treasury. Would the emperor allow Sir Fan Jr. to do this now? Ever since the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, lost power, this not too big or too small shock wave lightly swept through the hearts of the nobles under heaven and did not stir up any more waves. Of course, this was only the calm on the surface. No one knew exactly what the people were thinking in secret. However, everyone now knew how deeply the powerful official in the Qing court, Fan Xian, was favored and trusted by the Qing emperor, and how much power he held in his hands. Inevitably, the crowd grew wary and hopeful. No matter what was said, in the hearts of the people under heaven, Fan Xian was still a scholar. His performance on the stage these few years made it clear to everyone that he was different from the other noble sons of the Qing kingdom. He was not as hot-blooded and belligerent. Naturally, northern Qi and Dongyi hoped that Fan Xian would last a long time. No matter how much the northern Qi emperor wanted to pull Fan Xian to his side as a prince, he knew that Fan Xian staying in the Qing kingdom would benefit him the most. He hoped that Fan Xian would have as much power as possible and as much favor as possible. It would be best if he was powerful enough to influence the Qing emperor's decisions. However, this was only an extravagant hope and idealism. No emperor would be stupid enough to place his hopes of peace on an official of a foreign country. The peace between countries was, in the end, reflected in power. The power of a country was military power. Since the beginning of spring, in the vast wilderness to the north of Yanjing and east of Tsangzhou, northern Qi's mighty general, Shang Shanhu, had been released from house arrest and landed on the southern front. In a short amount of time, he established his absolute authority in the military. He began daily military drills, maintaining a powerful deterrent to the Qing army and suppressing the ambitions of the Qing people. Directly opposing Shang Shanhu was a general of the Qing kingdom, northern governor Yan Xiaoi. When these two powerful people collided, How could there not be some sparks and the smell of blood gradually rising? Although there was no fighting on the border, there were some small scuffles and purposely created tense atmosphere. Gradually, the air began to fill. Xia Mingji, which Xia Qifei was in charge of transporting palace treasury goods to the north, had to make a detour to the northern sea south of Tsangzhou because the situation in Tsangzhou had always been tense. However, all of this had completely changed this month. For some reason, Shang Shanhu had suddenly pulled back his troops 50 li to the north and moved his troop. He adopted a lazy posture of neither defending nor advancing. It was as if he did not care that Yan Xiaoi was leading 100,000 elite soldiers in the area between Yanjing and Tsangzhou. He stared like a bull, wanting to come up and take a bite at any moment. Tension suddenly became leisure. The display of power between the two countries suddenly became an outing. The instantaneous change made the Qing military feel an inexplicable anger and shock. What exactly were the northern Qi people thinking? Yan Xiaoi knew what the northern Qi people were thinking. He picked up his cup and drank a mouthful of the strong alcohol produced on the grasslands further north of the northern sea. The alcohol wetted his beard slightly. The cold light in his eyes gradually grew. Ever since the news from Jingdou had reached Tsangzhou, Yan Xiaoi knew he was facing a crisis. When his trusted aide lowered his voice and suggested ideas at night, he remained calm and didn't say a word. When Shang Shanhu led the northern Qi army and slowly withdrew, he assumed the posture of a naked woman reclining on the couch. Yan Xiaoi was not surprised or confused. He only smiled coldly. The northern Qi people also knew of the eldest princess' loss of power and knew that the emperor would certainly take him down. Thus, Shang Shanhu purposely showed weakness and removed all the pressure he had placed on Yan Xiaoi so that he could preserve all of his strength and spirit. What was the point of preserving this? Naturally, it was to deal with their own emperor. Yan Xiaoi slowly put down his wine cup. A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. If the northern Qi emperor suddenly wanted to act against Shang Shanhu, he would also do the same. There were internal problems in the enemy country. As his own side, he had to stand by and watch and give the enemy as much space and power as possible. Only in this way could the other side struggle themselves. After they killed each other, he could sit back and reap the benefits. It could not be said to be unpleasant. However, Yan Xiaoi didn't seem to have made any preparations. It was as if he was just waiting for that day. He was waiting for a few old and wrinkled eunuchs to come on horseback, exhausted, shouting themselves hoarse, and with faces full of terror. Yet, they forced themselves to be calm and announce the emperor's edict to him. Yan Xiaoi, wait, the eldest princess had fallen. As the eldest princess' trusted aide and her greatest support in the army, the emperor would not allow him to continue to control the elite soldiers of the Northern Expedition Army. Yan Xiaoi knew this very well. He had already made preparations, so he didn't see the anger on his trusted aide's face. However, contrary to his expectations, the emperor's edict had yet to arrive. Worry floated onto his face. He thought to himself, just what kind of crime does the emperor want to lay on me for it to take so long? The strong wine burned his heart. It burned Yan Xiaoi's heart. Did the emperor really trust him that much? The emperor knew that he had been nothing more than a hunter in the mountains. If it hadn't been for the eldest princess, he would probably have been unknown for his entire life. Furthermore, Fan Xian had killed his son. Although Yan Xiaoi had never found evidence, he believed that within the Qin kingdom, other than the emperor, there were only two crazy people who dared to kill his son. Other than the eldest princess, it was the crazy Fan Xian. The emperor could not kill his illegitimate child to avenge his son. This was the biggest irreconcilable conflict between Yan Xiaoi and the emperor. Yan Xiaoi's ruthless personality was destined to not surrender without a fight and die of old age in Jingdou. However, he would also not lead troops to throw themselves at the northern Qi ruler and officials watching the show in the north. That was a kind of humiliation. Yan Xiaoyi once again picked up the wine cup filled with strong wine and drained it in one gulp. Letting out a long sigh, he truly didn't know what to do. Then, he received a letter. The person who wrote this letter was someone he had never thought of. Looking at this letter, his hand holding the letter began to tremble. The hand that had always been as steady as a mountain, the hand that could control the bowstring like a god, and the hand that was still like steel under the pincer attack of the Shadow and Fan Xian, 2 9th-level aces, actually began to tremble. It was still the end of spring in the Qin kingdom, but far away on the border of the south, it was already blistering hot. All around, the lush forest was scorched weakly by the sun high up in the sky and laid softly on the mountain rocks. The vines on the mountain rocks had long withered from the high temperature of the rock. The heat was not scary. What was scary was the humidity in the dense forest. For some reason, there were so many torrential rains in the south. Although the rain did not last for long, when the rainwater fell to the ground, it did not even have time to sink into the earth before it was baked into steam by the high temperature. It enveloped the forest, animals, and people walking on the road, making it difficult for all living things to breathe. A majestic group was lazily walking on the road. The officials of the Ministry of Rites and Honglu Temple, who were responsible for the face of the heavenly kingdom, had pulled open their robes without a care for propriety. Military discipline had always been strict. The hundreds of imperial soldiers in shining armor also had their robes and hats askew. Even the tiger guards surrounding the carriages in the middle began to have a sense of tiredness and rashness in their eyes. In the carriage in the middle sat the crown prince of the Qin kingdom. It had been more than a month since he had left the capital. The ceremony in Nanzhao had gone smoothly. After holding the coffin and crying a few times in front of the deceased king's coffin and gently chatting a bit with the child king and witnessing the ascension ceremony, the crown prince and his group set off for the north. The reason they had chosen to travel under such a large sun was because when the sun was strong, it was not easy for fog to form in the forest. In the dense forest between Nanzhao and the Qin kingdom, the most terrifying thing was the poisonous fog. Crown Prince Li Chengqian knocked on the window of the carriage, indicating for the entire group to stop. He then walked down from the carriage with the help of a eunuch and quietly said something to the main official of the Ministry of Rites. A tiger guard respectfully said, "Your Highness, take advantage of the sun to leave in order to avoid being invaded by the poisonous fog." The crown prince smiled slightly and said, "Let's rest. Everyone is tired." "I'm afraid we won't be able to make it to the inn in front," the tiger guard said with difficulty. "Didn't I say yesterday that there was a small inn in front of the inn?" The crown prince said amiably. "It would be good to stay there tonight." The official from the Ministry of Rites, who had been questioned earlier, tried to dissuade him. "What kind of status does your Highness have? How can you just casually stay in the wilderness? The inn in Tianqing County is too rundown. The large inn we decided on last night has already been prepared to welcome your Highness." The crown prince insisted on not allowing it. He only said that his attendants were already exhausted. The official from the Ministry of Rites couldn't help but ask with some fear, "But if we miss the return date, I will bear all the responsibility. We can't let these soldiers tire themselves out until they fall ill," the crown prince said with a frown. An order was sent down for the hundreds of people to rest on the spot. They would spend the night in Tianqing County. They should be able to make it in time. Hearing these words, the soldiers and tiger guards immediately let out a breath and thanked the crown prince. They set up defenses on the two sides of the road and split up to rest. Everyone knew that the crown prince felt sorry for their hard work. They all gave him grateful gazes, but they didn't dare let the crown prince see these gazes. During this month, from Jingdo south to Nanzhao and then back north, the road was long and dangerous. However, the crown prince was not as delicate as people had imagined. He didn't make a sound. Furthermore, he comforted and encouraged his subordinates and was unspeakably amiable. Along the way, everyone had a new understanding of the Crown Prince. They felt that the Crown Prince truly pitied his people. Not only did he not have any resentment toward the Emperor's edict, he also never forgot about them. The Crown Prince received the edict to attend the ceremony in Nanzhao. In the eyes of the people of the world, such a difficult and unrewarding mission, even if the Emperor wasn't exiling the Crown Prince, he was still giving him a warning or a disguised punishment. But now these soldiers and officials were a bit puzzled. What could the Emperor not be satisfied with such an outstanding Crown Prince? A green curtain had been pulled up in the forest for the Crown Prince to rest. Everyone knew that it was mainly for the convenience of the Crown Prince's official duties. Although the Crown Prince had shared weal and woe with everyone along the way, they couldn't have a proper Crown Prince squat with everyone by the side of the road and defecate naked. Li Chengqian smiled helplessly at the imperial soldiers pulling the curtain. He lifted a corner of the curtain and walked in. However, he didn't undo his pants. He just waited calmly and slightly nervously. Not long after, a hand pinched a pill and sent it into the green grasshopper. It was clear that this had happened more than once. The Crown Prince directly accepted it, chewed it, and swallowed it. He then used the tip of his tongue to carefully lick the gap between his teeth to make sure there wouldn't be any medicinal residue left and be discovered by the eunuchs who were supposed to serve him but were secretly monitoring him. "Why can't you give this medicine to those soldiers?" The Crown Prince was silent for a moment. He then spoke to the faint shadow outside the curtain. His tone was slightly sad. 7 people have already died along the way. There was too much poisonous miasma in Nanzhao. Although the Imperial Academy of Medicine had prepared excellent medicine, there were still a few Imperial soldiers and eunuchs who accidentally inhaled the miasma and died. The shadow outside the curtain paused for a moment and then said, "Your Highness, I find that I like you more and more." After saying this, 13th Wang shook his head and disappeared without a sound. The Crown Prince crouched down and furrowed his brows slightly. He knew that 13th Wang had been sent by Fan Xian, but he didn't know why Fan Xian was so careful to protect him. However, Fan Xian's words were clear. He didn't need to accept any favors from him. However, he didn't like the feeling of an ace following him from afar. He had once tried to have that person give all the medicine to him. However, he had eunuchs serving him every night. If someone discovered that the Crown Prince had medicine of unknown origin on him, it would indeed be a big problem. However, without medicine on him, he couldn't save anyone. Thinking of the people who had died along the way, the Crown Prince couldn't help but sigh. He had behaved very well these days, to the point where he couldn't be any better. He knew what kind of person his father was. His father was looking for an excuse to depose him. If he couldn't find an excuse that wouldn't damage the Emperor's reputation, his father wouldn't act in a hurry. His father cared too much about his reputation, Li Chengqian thought with a slight smile. Standing up, he threw the used paper onto the ground, thinking, what was the difference between something like face and paper used to wipe one's butt? However, he indeed needed it. At least, because of this, Li Chengqian could hold on for a while longer. A stubborn expression rose to his face. "Father, I won't give you too many excuses. If you want to depose me, then don't think you can keep your reputation." He pulled open the curtain and walked out. Looking at the piercing sunlight in the sky, he suddenly thought of the child by the coffin of the Nanzhao king. Slightly absent-minded, he thought to himself that they were both crown princes. For a father to die early was actually a fortunate thing. Chapter 5:15. After many months of trekking, Crown Prince Li Chengqian and his group finally returned to Jingdou from the distant Nanzhao kingdom. The road outside Jingdou was not paved with yellow earth or sprinkled with clear water. The green-black stone road smoothly stuck to the ground, welcoming the return of the heir apparent. The lush willows on either side of the road nodded slightly with the hot wind, indicating to the Crown Prince. Outside the city gates, welcoming the Crown Prince's return, were the civil and military officials of the court, as well as the 3 princes who had stayed in the capital. After the greetings, the Crown Prince gently helped his 2 elder brothers and younger brother up. Holding hands and looking at each other, he gently spoke of the situation after they parted. The great prince looked at the Crown Prince with concern. After confirming that this difficult journey had not tortured his younger brother too much, he finally relaxed. Like everyone else, he was guessing why his father had given this task to the Crown Prince. However, his status was different from other people's. Additionally, his personality was indifferent, so he was not willing to think too deeply. In any case, what happened had nothing to do with him. It was fine as long as Chengqian was fine. The second prince, who had been silent in the manor for almost half a year, welcomed the Crown Prince's return with his trademark smile. However, there was something else in his smile that seeped into the Crown Prince's heart bit by bit. The Crown Prince smiled slightly at him and nodded his head. He didn't say anything. Li Chengqian held the third prince's hand and looked at the quiet and obedient face of the little boy beside him. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The situation had developed to this day, but his youngest brother had already faintly become his greatest opponent. It was truly difficult to understand. He suddenly thought of the new king of Nanzhao. He seemed to be about the same age as the third prince. His heart suddenly trembled. His hand holding the third prince's hand unconsciously loosened. However, before his index finger had completely curled up, he reacted and gently and seriously held the little hand again. The Crown Prince knew that his third brother was much smarter than the snot-nosed king of Nanzhao. Furthermore, his teacher was Fan Xian. However, the third prince's gaze as he looked at the Crown Prince appeared very calm. It far exceeded the calmness a child should have. Furthermore, there was not a trace of other emotions. A few of the dragon sons stood outside the city gates, each with their own thoughts. The Crown Prince lowered his head slightly and looked at the lonely shadows in the sunlight. He thought with some sadness that it seemed that father and son killing each other was unavoidable. Did brothers also have to hack at each other? The Crown Prince entered the palace, bowed, replied to the letter, kowtowed to the emperor, and returned to the palace. All of the procedures were as normal and smooth as the Ministry of Rites and the 2 temples had stipulated. There was not a single problem. At least, no one noticed that the emperor and the Crown Prince's expressions were the slightest bit abnormal. However, people noticed that the emperor seemed to be a bit tired and did not keep the Crown Prince in Taiji Palace to talk. It was completely unlike the expression a son who had not seen for nearly half a year should have when he returned home. He allowed the Crown Prince to return to the Eastern Palace. Led by eunuch Yao, the Crown Prince arrived outside the Eastern Palace. He raised his head to look at the Eastern Palace that had been repaired and couldn't help but sigh in shock. That day, he had burned down this beautiful and magnificent palace. It had only been a few months, but it had been repaired to its original state. It looked like his father really didn't want to make the matter too sensational. He suddenly stilled and turned his head to ask eunuch Yao, "I want to go pay my respects to the Empress Dowager later. Is that possible?" Eunuch Yao paused. He was responsible for escorting the Crown Prince back to the Eastern Palace. Naturally, he reported to the emperor to secretly monitor him. He had to ensure that the Crown Prince could only return to the palace. This was a disguised form of house arrest. However, the Crown Prince had suddenly asked and used such a reason. Eunuch Yao could not say anything. He laughed bitterly and slowly lowered his body. In a slightly sharp voice he said, "Your Highness has scared me. You are the master. You want to go see the Empress Dowager. Why are you asking me?" The Crown Prince smiled bitterly and didn't say anything. He pushed open the main doors of the Eastern Palace. As he entered, he unconsciously glanced in the direction of Guangxin Palace. He knew that his aunt had already been imprisoned in a side courtyard of the royal palace and was being guarded by the people of the Overwatch Council. The Guangxin Palace that he was familiar with and yearned for was already empty, but he still couldn't resist greedily glancing in that direction. To the side, Eunuch Yao carefully and inconspicuously watched the Crown Prince's expression. The Crown Prince acted as if he didn't exist and stared in that direction in a daze. He thought to himself, as people lived in this world, there were always so many demons. He didn't know who was possessed or who was crazy. He thought of the words his aunt had said, and his heart began to thump. Yes, people were crazy. The world was crazy. Everyone in the royal family had crazy genes. If he wanted to own the world, he had to be crazy to the end. Because of his craziness and self-control, he turned around again and smiled warmly at Eunuch Yao. He then closed the main doors of the Eastern Palace. Logically, the act of closing the doors should be done by serving girls and eunuchs. However, the number of eunuchs and serving girls in the Eastern Palace was far less than the number set by etiquette. A few months ago, hundreds of eunuchs and serving girls disappeared without reason. No one knew where they went. The Crown Prince knew they went underground. Although the Eastern Palace had been replenished with many eunuchs and serving girls, these newbies were clearly nervous. So many people had died in the royal palace. Naturally, it couldn't be hidden for long. However, no official dared to ask. For one, this was not something they should care about. For two, the officials were also afraid of death. Along the way, serving girls and eunuchs kowtowed in greeting, but no one dared to come forward to serve. The Crown Prince laughed self-mockingly and entered the main hall. Then, he furrowed his brows and sniffed. He smelled a thick smell of alcohol. A thick, nauseating smell of alcohol floated in the most noble palace in the Qin kingdom. The light in the hall was dim. There were only a few tall lamps lit. Li Chengqian was startled and regained his sight. Only then did he see a familiar woman lying on the couch. To the side of the screen, a large leaf fan produced by the palace treasury was being waved. It fanned a light breeze and dispersed the suffocating smell in the hall. The woman wore a luxurious palace dress, but the decorations were terrible. Her hair was a bit unkempt. She held a wine jug in her hand and was currently pouring wine into her mouth. Between her brows was a haggard and hopeless expression. The person holding the large leaf fan was a young eunuch whose appearance could not be seen clearly. Li Chengqian furrowed his brows in disgust. Shortly after, he sighed. A glimmer of gentleness and pity rose in his eyes as he walked forward. He knew why his mother had become like this. He also loathed how she usually pretended to be mysterious. Once the truth was revealed, she would panic beyond belief. However, she was, after all, his mother. "Mother, I'm back." The half-drunk empress was startled. She rubbed her eyes and looked for a moment before she saw clearly that the young man in front of her was her son. A moment later, she suddenly burst into tears and sat up unsteadily. She threw herself in front of the Crown Prince and hugged him. Wailing, she said, "It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back." The Crown Prince hugged his mother's body and smiled warmly. "I've been gone for many months. I've made you worry." A glimmer of joy flashed through the Empress's eyes. She said unclearly, "It's good that you're alive. I thought I would never see you again." Ever since the Emperor had sent the Crown Prince to Nanzhao, the Empress's mind had been immersed in despair. She and the Emperor had been husband and wife for 20 years. Of course, she knew how heartless and terrifying the man on the dragon chair was. She had originally thought that it would be difficult for the Crown Prince to return after going south this time. Seeing her son alive and well, she couldn't help but be overjoyed. She found a fleeting glimmer of hope in her despair. The Crown Prince smiled self-mockingly. He hugged his mother and patted her back, comforting her with a few words. Up until now, the Empress still did not know why the Emperor had suddenly given up on the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince also did not tell her the truth. Although the people of the royal family were crazy, they did a pretty good job in the area of filial piety. Thus, the crown prince did not plan on telling his mother how many dangers and difficulties he had encountered along the way. If it wasn't for someone secretly helping him, even if he could return alive, he would probably be bedridden and unable to rise again. Before long, the half-drunk empress gradually fell asleep in the crown prince's arms. The crown prince carried her to the bed and pulled over a thin embroidered towel. He waved his hand to stop the eunuch who was pulling the large leaf fan. He took out a round fan and began to carefully fan the empress. After fanning for a long time and confirming that his mother had fallen asleep, the crown prince threw down the round fan and sat by the bed in a daze. Burying his head deeply between his knees, he did not raise it for a long time. He raised his head. His face was slightly pale. His gaze drifted to the side. Looking at the only eunuch in this empty and lonely palace, he asked, "Has the empress often drunk these days?" "Yes." The young eunuch walked out of the shadows and knelt down respectfully. Looking at the eunuch's raised face, the crown prince was shocked. He immediately furrowed his brows and said with slight mockery, "There are over 100 people in the Eastern Palace. Now only you are still alive." The eunuch was none other than the original head eunuch of the Eastern Palace, Hong Zhu. A glimmer of guilt rose to Hong Zhu's face. He lowered his head and didn't say anything. Up to this point, all of the servants in the Eastern Palace had been silenced by the emperor's edict. Only he was alive. This already explained all of the truth. Although Hong Zhu had never told the emperor, he had told Fan Xian. All of this seemed to have started because of this, so the guilt on Hong Zhu's face was not fake. During his days in the Eastern Palace, the Empress and the Crown Prince had both treated him well, particularly the Empress who had been especially warm to him. These days, he had been following the Emperor's strict orders to secretly serve and monitor the Empress. Seeing how the mother of the nation had gone from disappointment to despair, using alcohol day and night to numb herself, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pity in his heart. The Crown Prince looked at him calmly and suddenly smiled unhappily. He said to himself, "At the beginning, I thought you had offended Fan Xian, which was why father had sent you here. So, I had forgotten. In the end, you are someone from the royal study. Then, is the enmity between you and the Duke of Danbo real?" "It is real," Hong Zhu lowered his head and replied. "However, I am a citizen of the Qin kingdom. Naturally, I will follow the emperor's orders." For some reason, the crown prince suddenly flew into a rage. Casually grabbing something beside him, he threw it over and cursed loudly, "You eunuch, how dare you call yourself a citizen?" The thing he threw out was the round fan he had fanned the empress with earlier. It floated lightly and didn't hit Hong Zhu. Instead, it floated down beside Hong Zhu and landed on the lapel of the eunuch's robes. The crown prince was afraid of waking up the empress and calmed his breathing with great difficulty. He looked at Hong Zhu with a hateful gaze. "It looks like the emperor truly likes you. Knowing such a major matter, he still left you with your dog life." Hong Zhu kowtowed twice and asked with some confusion, "Your Highness, what is it?" The crown prince came to his senses and was silent for a moment. He then suddenly said, "The Eastern Palace is not what it used to be. What are you still doing here? If you want to leave, I will go and tell father." Hong Zhu's expression was hesitant. A moment later, he gritted his teeth and said, "I want to stay in the Eastern Palace." "Stay in the Eastern Palace to monitor?" The crown prince lowered his voice and said mockingly, "The entire palace is filled with spies. Who cares if you are one more?" Now that things had developed to this point, the crown prince knew that the emperor was going to depose him. Since that was the case, why was he still putting on an act in this secret palace? "I want to serve the empress." After the crown prince was silent for a moment, he suddenly sighed. A trace of pity rose to his face. He gazed at Hong Zhu and said, "Xior also died?" Kneeling on the ground, Hong Zhu's body trembled. After a long time, he nodded his head sorrowfully. The crown prince gazed calmly at Hongzhu and asked a question that, logically speaking, would never have an answer. What has happened in the palace these few months? Hongzhu was silent for a long time. He then said, the emperor went to Hongguang Palace a few times. Each time he came out, he was not very happy. The crown prince had a slight smile on his face. His mood relaxed slightly. He looked at Hongzhu with approval and said, "Thank you." Hongzhu lowered his head and said, "I wouldn't dare." The crown prince sat by the side of the bed and began to think. It was clear that his father had not told the Empress Dowager the truth of this matter. Although the emperor moved unhindered under heaven and no one dared to stop him, an emperor like his father was still troubled by a thread of ties in his heart. For example, his face was like toilet paper, and that filial piety. The Qing kingdom paid particular attention to using filial piety to rule the world. The emperor had put a cage around himself. Li Chengxian clenched his fists tightly. He knew he still had some time. His father was going to depose him and needed time to arrange the discussion. Even if the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council wanted to create that kind of rumor, it would not be easy. Xior died. "I wonder how Hongzhu feels," Fan Xian said quietly. "If it was a normal eunuch, perhaps he wouldn't think too much about it. However, I know that Hongzhu has never been a simple eunuch. He has studied and been enlightened, so he cares about gratitude and grudges and values friendship. When all is said and done, the reason Xiao was killed is my problem and his problem. It was the two of us who single-handedly caused the deaths of hundreds of people in the royal palace." He furrowed his brows. "When it comes to the emperor's ruthlessness, it seems that our imagination is still lacking. Fine, even if Hongzhu doesn't hate me, he must hate himself. Will there be any trouble like this?" He once again said, "Fine," and then said with great sadness, "But those hundreds of deaths were caused by me. Yes, I am a very indifferent and emotionless person. In the end, I am not a monster like Uncle Wu Zhu. I still feel strange in my heart. In the past, I told Haitang that if I killed dozens or hundreds of people, I wouldn't even blink. But I can't be the emperor because I can't keep calm when tens of thousands of people die in front of me. The emperor wanted to depose the crown prince because I secretly influenced him. Of course, even if I didn't influence it, this matter would have exploded in the end." Fan Xian shook his head. "But now I want the emperor to not depose the crown prince so quickly. Why? Isn't this very senseless and absurd? What exactly am I afraid of? After the oil is added to the raging fire, it will be the leftovers from the cold pot." He laughed self-mockingly. "If the crown prince, second prince, and eldest princess are finished, then I will be the leftovers. Even if the emperor truly loves me and is willing to take me to conquer a great world, you also know that I am a pacifist. Yes, a very hypocritical pacifist. I don't like fighting. Haven't I done so many things these 2 years to maintain my current state? Thus I have to delay a bit. At least, before I am ready, I cannot let the emperor enter the path of preparing for war. When the time comes, I will have the eldest prince lead the army and have me be the supervisor. We will kill our way into northern Qi and Dongyi. Our knives will be full of dead souls. Just thinking about these days of blood and iron makes me sad. This is the main hidden contradiction. You know that." After Fan Xian said this, he put away the piece of paper in front of him and placed it back into the box. He then began to sigh. He was angry at his own curiosity. Each time, he couldn't resist taking out his mother's letter and reading it again. Each time, it was very troublesome. He was in Hangzhou, in Hua Garden. The large box in front of the door was still open. The snowflake silver inside flickered with a beautiful light. Like Minister Fan, he had also learned to speak to a piece of paper. However, his father was facing a portrait. He didn't have that ability, so he could only speak to the letter. There were many things that could not be said to others. The only people he could say were not by his side, so Fan Xian had a hard time holding it in. There had been a period of time in the past when he had even treated Wang Qinian as his best listener. In order to prevent the old man from being frightened into a heart attack by his words, he had finally stopped his mental torture of Wang Qinian. Uncle Wu Zhu was not here. Ruoro was not here. Wan was not here. Haitang was not here. Even if he had 1,000 words, to whom could he pour them out? Where could he find support for thoughts that were rebellious and could not tolerate this world? Fan Xian began to gradually feel that sense of loneliness, the meaning hidden in "I am very lonely." Chapter 5:16. In reality, every person, at certain times, would look back at their life, trace back the past, and look forward to the future. This was the so-called yesterday, today, and tomorrow. However, under normal circumstances, this kind of work was often only begun after people had grown tired of life or after they had reached a certain goal. The most common model was an old man fishing beside the Wei River while sighing about how life was like the flowing water under one's feet, flowing east and never returning. Fan Xian was not Ku He. He did not have the hobby of fishing, and he was still young. However, his life had one more repetition than anyone else in this world. Calculating carefully, he should be a middle-aged man in his 30s, about to know his destiny. However, he was forced to stay in a beautiful, fragrant bag. The word "forced" was a bit pretentious, so let's not talk about it for now. However, he would still carry out some reflection. It was not holding a beautiful woman and lamenting that he did not work hard for the good and just cause of humanity. Rather, he was searching for clarity in a kind of chaos, trying to find his determination and clear goal again. The present him was a bit muddled. After being reborn, he had always been a person with a firm goal. On the cliff, he had once made 3 great wishes to Uncle Wu Zhu with the 3 representatives as the foundation. Up to now, the 3 great wishes had basically been fulfilled. However, there were few people who were as lustful as Fan Xian. The number of women by his side had never increased. The foundation of the 3 great wishes was to continue living. For the sake of this goal, he had always worked hard, tough, and cold-blooded. Furthermore, the hidden skill or additional attribute of the 3 great wishes was the life ideal he had spoken of to Minister Fan, a powerful official. Presently, in the Qin Kingdom and under heaven, Fan Xian could truly be called a powerful official. Wherever he went, no one disrespected him, and no one did not fear him. However, it was truly like this. In the end, the young man who knew his destiny still became muddled. Was this really the life he wanted? He was walking alone on the road from Hua Garden to the Jiangnan governor's mansion. I seem to have written a wrong place yesterday, sorry. He lowered his head like a philosopher, but a few tiger guards followed behind him. There were also many Overwatch Council secret agents protecting him from the shadows on both sides of the street. Sir Fan Jr. Duke. Imperial Envoy. Commissioner. A string of names full of passion, flattery, and slight fear rang out from beside him. Fan Xian was startled and raised his head in astonishment. He found that he had already walked into the Jiangnan governor's manor. The officials of Jiangnan were standing on either side of him, looking at him with gazes full of affection and unspeakable passion and gentleness. It was as if the entire yamen, with his arrival, had suddenly been filled with countless fine horses that had eaten bad fodder, farting thunderously. Fan Xian unconsciously scratched his head, not minding that this action had lost some of his official prestige. He laughed self-mockingly, driving away all the metaphysical things that had surrounded his mind earlier. Yes, life did indeed need a goal, but perhaps it was too early for him to start doubting life. Newton didn't become a real swindler until he was old, while Xiao Ai spent the latter half of her life gnashing her teeth at the Unification Army. However, these two people were, after all, back to the basics. Who was she? In the end, he was still a commoner. He had to admit that he still enjoyed the benefits of vanity, power, money, and fame. As Fan Xian greeted the officials amiably, he walked toward the study of the governor's manor. He thought to himself that he was different from Yi Qingmei. It was best not to sprinkle the glory of idealism on himself. In this world, no, in all worlds, idealists were lonely and easy to die a violent death. Fan Xian could not accept either of these. It's better to be an honest official, he thought to himself. However, when he walked into Xueqing's study and chatted with Xueqing for a long time with his head lowered, he began to laugh at himself inside. Was being a powerful official something that could be done just because one wanted to? That would depend on whether or not the emperor allowed it. A muddle-headed and incompetent emperor could be controlled by a powerful official, but how could someone like the emperor give him such an opportunity? He had lived for over 30 years, how could he still be so naive and adorable? He stretched lazily and narrowed his eyes at Xueqing, who was resting with his eyes closed. He cursed silently in his heart and opened his mouth to say, "Things like checking accounts can be left to the Ministry of Revenue. The palace treasury has always been managed by the Overwatch Council. Why did the Imperial Censorate suddenly get involved? Didn't the Imperial Censors all go to prison a few months ago? Where did the Imperial Censorate find so many people to check accounts? Even if there were enough people, those people who only know how to stick to their books would probably faint when they saw the numbers on the account. Sir Xue, you have to submit a memorial on this matter. Jiangnan is fine, yet some people have come. It is truly unbearable." Xueqing smiled and cursed silently in his heart. The Ministry of Revenue was opened by your old man, the Overwatch Council was managed by you, and the palace treasury was sat on by you. What was there to check? Jingdo had long had objections to this matter. Now, the Hall of Governmental Affairs had come up with a new idea. They were afraid that you would steal everything from the palace treasury and sell it. However, Fan Xian had been in Jiangnan for a year and a half and worked well with Xueqing. The two of them had a tacit understanding. Who knew how much Xueqing had profited from him? These words could not be said clearly. After thinking for a bit, he said, "It's not impossible to have someone come to check, but you have a long-standing grudge with the Imperial Censorate. If you have them investigate, who knows if they will use their power to avenge a personal grudge." These words could only ever be said in private by these high-ranking officials. Can they not be stopped? Do that old man Xu Wu and Hu the scholar have nothing better to do? In any case, there were no outsiders in the study, so Fan Xian spoke angrily. However, he knew that although it was the Hall of Governmental Affairs who had sent the letter, it was actually the Emperor's intention. Having him hold the palace treasury and Overwatch Council in one hand was, in the end, not a suitable method. He had mixed a handful of Hizongwei's sand into the Overwatch Council in Jingdo and had been suppressed to the point of not daring to breathe by Ping Ping. Fan Xian was wary of whether or not the Emperor did not believe his explanation regarding Zhaoshang Money House or was wary of his relationship with the Northern Qi people. As for the matter of smuggling, he didn't care much. The eldest princess had already been gone for a decade, and he had only earned a year's worth of profit. With a flip of his hand, he had sent so much silver to the national treasury. The Emperor would not be so stingy. Seeing Fan Xian's slightly unhappy expression, Xueqing laughed and comfortingly said, "It's all for the people in court to see. What are you worried about? Even if they sent an imperial envoy to lead the 3 departments to investigate, with a flip of your hand, who would be able to find anything? Don't forget, you are also an imperial envoy." Xueqing flipped his hand and took advantage of the situation to grab the cup of tea on the table and take a sip. Fan Xian stared at his steady hand and a thought flashed through his mind. Xueqing knew a little about the smuggling matter, but he didn't know the inside story, which was why he appeared so calm. If he knew that Fan Xian was secretly damaging the interests of the Qing kingdom, this old man would probably throw this cup of tea to the ground in shock. He was just about to pour some more oil and add to the fire when he unexpectedly saw Xue Qing put down the teacup and change his expression to one of seriousness. When interacting in officialdom, particularly between a local emperor like Xue Qing and a prince like Fan Xian, they would talk about important matters in a joking manner. This was to prevent them from feeling too estranged from each other and having an undesirable tendency towards coldness. Thus, it was the first time Fan Xian had seen Xue Qing's serious expression. He couldn't help but furrow his brows. Xue Qing was silent for a long time. He then slowly opened his mouth and said, "Sir Fan Jr., you know more about the Jingdo matter than I do. What is your opinion?" "Opinion? Opinion my ass. I have no opinion at all on such a major matter." Fan Xian closed his mouth and didn't make a sound. He only smiled and looked at the beard on Xue Qing's chin as if he admired it. In any case, in this world, other than the great grandmasters and the emperor, he wasn't afraid of anyone. Naturally, he dared to put on such a clay statue appearance. Xue Qing coughed and looked at Fan Xian's appearance. He knew that his question was too unprofessional and that the other party's shamelessness was even better than his. He smiled self-mockingly. After thinking for a moment, he straightforwardly said, "Let's be frank. The emperor is going to depose the heir." Fan Xian was startled as if he hadn't heard these words clearly. A moment later, he came to his senses and abruptly stood up. Staring into Xue Qing's eyes, he didn't speak for a long time. He was indeed shocked in his heart. He was not shocked at the deposed heir or that Xue Qing was discussing it with him. He was shocked that since Xue Qing dared to say it to his face, it was certainly not something he had guessed. Rather, the emperor in the palace had already leaked the news to his loyal followers. At the same time, he was beginning to spread the news in all directions through him. Was public opinion about to begin? Xue Qing's fingers gently tapped the surface of the table. Looking at him, he smiled slightly and said, "Sir Fan Jr., why are you so shocked? Isn't this within your expectations?" He suddenly sighed. A trace of pity flashed between his brows. Slowly, he said, "Actually, I'm not afraid of you knowing. I've already submitted memorials to persuade the emperor to give up on this idea. However, it was to no avail." "You want me to also submit memorials?" Fan Xian looked at him. Xue Qing said with slight mockery, "Everyone knows what your relationship with the crown prince is. I am not that stupid." Pausing for a moment, he quietly said, "The emperor has already made up his mind. As officials, we can only act according to the rules." Speaking of this, Xue Qing paused again. It seemed that he was also very confused. The crown prince had clearly grown up these 2 years. He was sincere and had improved in all areas. Why did the emperor suddenly want to depose the heir? However, he faintly guessed that something must have happened within the royal family. In front of Fan Xian, the illegitimate son of the royal family, he would not voice his doubts. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then asked, "How many people know of this matter?" "In Jiangnan, of course, only you and I know," Xue Qing said. "However, I believe that the governors of the 7 roads have all received the emperor's secret edict. It all depends on when everyone will submit the edict." Fan Xian laughed coldly in his heart. The emperor was truly ruthless, even to the point of being muddle-headed. The crown prince's performance this year had been excellent. Not only did he not make any mistakes on his trip to Nanzhao, he had also won the praise of everyone in court. Presumably, if the emperor wanted to depose the heir, it would be too difficult to find an excuse. However, although the words of the 7 roads governors had great power, they were, after all, officials. Who would lead them to do such a thing? Even if it was the emperor's secret edict, the 7 governors were not idiots. Presumably, they would not believe that they would have any good ending if they participated in the battle for the throne. Xue Qing seemed to see what he was thinking and slowly said, "Presumably, I am the first official to submit a memorial to admonish the emperor for deposing the heir." Fan Xian calmly gazed into Xue Qing's eyes. He knew that this person was loyal to the emperor, but he had not thought that he would be loyal to such a degree. The reason? He furrowed his brows and reminded the other party. Xue Qing smiled slightly and looked at Fan Xian. "This is the reason I invited you here today. The emperor's meaning is clear. The 8th Bureau should be moving." Fan Xian had already returned to his chair. He tilted his head slightly and was lost in thought. To depose the heir, he had to use the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council to start. Back in the day, many of the Crown Prince's weaknesses had fallen into the hands of the Internal Court and Overwatch Council. Additionally, there was the Jiangnan Ming family lawsuit regarding the battle for the legitimate eldest son's right to inheritance. No matter how one looked at this matter, if the emperor wanted to depose the Crown Prince, he should be the lackey. His expression was calm. It was impossible to see the agitation in his heart. A moment later, he said, "The places are places, and Jingdo is Jingdo. If it is just these actions, the backlash from the court will be great. The scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs will not watch as the Crown Prince is deposed for no reason." What he said was the truth. The civil officials wholeheartedly worked for the Qing kingdom and sought stability. Regarding the emperor's seemingly absurd action, they would strongly oppose it. Who knew how many more strikes of the cane would ring out in court? In particular, the Overwatch Council cannot appear, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "It is not convenient for me to appear. The Overwatch Council is a secret agency. I have never been on good terms with the Crown Prince. If some words come out of my mouth, it will only have the opposite effect." "Your words are reasonable. I will report to the emperor," Xue Qing said after thinking for a bit. Xue Qing thought about it and then said, "There is something His Majesty wants me to tell you. In a few days, His Majesty will go to worship the heavens." Fan Xian was surprised again. He furrowed his brows for a long time before he slowly understood. Although the way of ghosts and gods could not prevail in the Qing kingdom and was not as deeply rooted in the hearts of the people as northern Qi's Tianidao, they still had great respect for the illusory temple. If the emperor could actually create some heavenly revelation with public opinion attacking the Crown Prince first, the governors of the 7 roads sending in memorials, and then finding some officials to accuse the Crown Prince of being immoral and unfit to inherit the country, in the end, the emperor was put in a difficult position. He personally went to worship heaven in the temple and accepted heaven's order to depose the heir. What an absurd play, what a senseless trick. Fan Xian shook his head and asked, "When?" Chapter 5:17. There is a typo, a big typo, bothering me. A few days ago, a friend reminded me in the book review section. I thank you very much. However, I didn't add to it at the time. Now I've forgotten your ID. I'm truly sorry. Most importantly, there was a power outage yesterday. Although I had the book, I lost the internet. I was in a rush to go to a classmate's house to update and wrote the chapter names wrong. What bitter tears. It should have been a ridiculous thing. I'm truly sorry. Today I was looking at the monthly vote rankings. Qing Yu is 4th in the old book. Oh no. Amidst the screams, 5th, 200 fewer votes than the top 3. Shake as hard as you can, shake as hard as you can to get the votes out of your jars. The Crown Prince and Fan Xian were brothers by blood. There was no irreconcilable hatred between the two. In the end, that was a matter for the elders. The Crown Prince had once expressed his desire to reconcile with Fan Xian, but Fan Xian did not believe him. Most importantly, Fan Xian knew that the Crown Prince did not have enough power or a strong state of mind to bring him down. Thus, the biggest target of Fan Xian's actions during this half a year was the eldest princess. He had not thought that the emperor would only imprison her in the end and rush to depose the crown prince. This reality made Fan Xian ponder for a long time. He always felt that there was a problem with the order. Given the emperor's many years of immersion in the arena, he shouldn't have made such a mistake. Regardless of whether or not there was a mistake in the order, the matter of deposing the heir had, in the end, spread out with a bang in the Qin court. Perhaps using the word bang was not accurate. The wind rises at the end of a duckweed. Any major event in history, at the beginning, was perhaps just some unremarkable wind in the officialdom. A few months ago, the Eastern Palace had caught fire and the Crown Prince had gone to Nanzhao. When the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council threw out some old stories, the Supreme Court suddenly became interested and reinvestigated the matter of the winter coats of the Northern Army. The Ministry of Revenue began to cooperate in researching where the silver had gone. The wind gradually grew. In the spring of last year, in order to attack Fan Xian, the Crown Prince and the Second Prince's factions had investigated the Ministry of Revenue. In the end, the biggest loophole they found was the problem of the winter jackets of the Northern Expedition Army. At the time, the Crown Prince had not thought that this matter would eventually lead to him. Fortunately, His Majesty stopped in the end, and the Crown Prince avoided the fate of losing face. But now that the court had brought up this old matter again, all the officials in the court could smell something different. The Crown Prince no longer had many loyal figures. Who was the Emperor going to let the Crown Prince throw out to atone for his crimes? Even at this time, no official thought that the Emperor would directly have the Crown Prince take responsibility for this crime. When the Supreme Court and the Overwatch Council took Xian Qiwu into prison, they all thought that this matter was over for now. Who would have thought that Xian Qiwu would be released after only 3 days in prison? Xian Qiwu was a confidant of the Eastern Palace and a close official of the Crown Prince. Because of his good relationship with Fan Xian, he was not tortured in the Overwatch Council and did not betray the Crown Prince. Even so, the Overwatch Council and Supreme Court still bit the Crown Prince and presented the secret memorial to the royal study. In another meeting in the royal study, it was presented to the eyes of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the ministers of the 6 ministries, and other figures in the center of Qin Kingdom's power. Xu Wu and Hu the scholar pleaded for leniency for the Crown Prince, and even acted as a guarantor. Only then did the Emperor dispel his feigned anger. After the court was dismissed, when the 2 scholars gathered together to drink again, they couldn't resist sighing and sighing. The Emperor was truly determined to depose the heir. As scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, they had to protect the Crown Prince. This had nothing to do with faction. It was just an attitude they had to express as pure officials. As long as the Crown Prince was the heir, they had to treat him like half an emperor. The Emperor would not criticize them harshly. Most importantly, the officials in court, represented by Hu and Xu, all thought that the Crown Prince may have been preposterous and muddle-headed in the past, but he had improved a great deal these 2 years. In order to prevent the court from being shaken by the fight for royal power and in order to prevent Fan Xian, far away in Jiangnan, from participating in these matters, they truly hoped that the Emperor would be able to calm his heart and set the Qin Kingdom's distant future. No matter how one looked at it, the present Crown Prince was the best choice for Qin Kingdom. It not only prevented internal friction in Qin Kingdom, but it also prevented the Overwatch Council, the young man's domination. The Qing Emperor was not an incapable ruler. He knew the benefits the checks and balances between ruler and officials brought to Qin Kingdom. He also expected that the matter of deposing the heir would certainly cause a great wave of opposition. Thus, he temporarily chose to be silent. It seemed that after the first wave, his thoughts of deposing the heir had been dispelled. However, Hu the scholar and all of the officials knew that their emperor was not someone who made decisions easily. Once he made a choice, no matter what difficulties he faced, he would persevere to the end. As expected, a few days later, the governor of Jiangnan Road, Sir Xueqing's memorial was delivered to the palace. It was read in court. Every word and sentence was directed at the Eastern Palace. Everyone knew the hidden meaning. Xu Wu flew into a rage. Although he knew that this situation could not be reversed, he still stepped out of line and loudly cursed Xueqing for having a disloyal heart and spouting nonsense. The emperor pitied Xu Wu's old and weak body and ordered him to return to his manor to rest for 3 months. He did not punish him at all. The other 6 governors' memorials arrived. Their tones were either heavy or light, overt or covert, but they all subtly expressed their attitude. The situation was gradually becoming clear. The emperor wanted to depose the heir. The governors of the 7 roads were forced by the emperor's might to submit memorials in response. Only the officials in court were caught in the middle. Even if they wanted to object, they felt the sky above them was covering them and the thorns below them were rising. They felt uncomfortable all over. Although Xu Wu had been invited back to his manor, the Hall of Governmental Affairs continued to perform the righteous role that the Qing emperor allowed them to perform. The courageous officials in court chose their words carefully and expressed their opposition. The timid maintained their silence. Not a single official, under the emperor's hint, courageously submitted a memorial asking the emperor to change the heir. Even the most flattering people would find it difficult to do such a thing. All the civil and military officials in court and the people of Jingdo were watching these officials. The crown prince had not made any major mistakes, yet he was going to be deposed. It was truly inexcusable and would be impossible to explain in the history books in the future. After the court conference adjourned, a few representatives of the civil officials came to the Shu manor and carefully asked for Shu the scholar's opinion. In any case, the emperor knew about these things, so they were not afraid of someone reporting that they had formed a clique. Xu Wu was wearing a cloth robe. After a long silence, he smiled and said, "All things in the world have to pay attention to a reason, particularly the matter of the heir to the throne. It involves the will of heaven and the people. If it does not make sense, then it cannot be served. Fan Xian once said, "The worries of the world come first and the joys of the world come later." This is a national matter, not a family matter of the emperor. As an official, I have to help the emperor solve his worries and remove the worries of the Qing kingdom. There is no need to try to figure out the emperor's heart. Just ask your own. The emperor has already made up his mind. What can be done?" Xu Wu stroked the beard on his chin and laughed as he usually did. Sir once said that an official cannot accept the emperor's messy orders. The Sir he spoke of was the master of the manor, Zhuang Mohan, who had passed away 2 years ago. The civil officials split up and went home, each of them silent. In reality, if the emperor wanted to hint to the officials to send in memorials, there were many other ways to easily find the spokespersons in court. Strangely, ever since the storm began, other than the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, the emperor had never summoned any official into the palace alone. Thus, the officials were also confused as to whether or not the emperor's mind had not been made up. They were not the governor of the 7 roads, the emperor's servants, so they did not dare to randomly send in memorials. The court sank into an awkward, silent confrontation. In the Eastern Palace, the crown prince, who was at the center of the matter, remained warm and quiet. It was as if he did not take this matter to heart. There were no capable people in his faction, yet he had won the support of so many civil officials. This could be said to be an unexpected joy, but it was also an unexpected shock. Thus, while the crown prince was secretly grateful, he grew increasingly silent. In this storm of deposing the heir, there were 2 young people who stood out of the matter and attracted the eyes of the officials the most. The appearances and temperaments of these 2 young nobles were similar. Furthermore, their relationships with the crown prince were complicated. Yet, up until now, their behavior had been unexpected. The first was Fan Xian. In people's eyes, he was a true member of the Third Prince's faction. Furthermore, he was the emperor's illegitimate child. His identity was too sensitive. Before and after the governor of the Seven Roads sent in memorials, he maintained a deathly silence in Jiangnan. His daily invitations to the palace did not mention this matter at all. He only talked in circles about the palace treasury and the daily affairs around it. Although the Overwatch Council had investigated the Eastern Palace from the Ministry of Revenue, it was clear that their investigation was not as strong as the officials had imagined. Everyone could see clearly that the Overwatch Council's actions in Jingdo had nothing to do with Fan Xian. Thus, people suddenly thought of something. Did the emperor throw Fan Xian to Jiangnan also have the intention of cutting him off from the Overwatch Council? Why did Commissioner Fan, who was always gentle on the outside and determined on the inside, not take this opportunity to beat him when he was down? The second was the second prince. Before Fan Xian entered the capital, the second prince had always been deeply favored by the emperor. He was the first of the emperor's sons to be made a king and had a large group of civil officials at his side in court. Later, everyone learned that the eldest princess was protecting the crown prince in the open but was secretly protecting him. This second prince was not simple. He faintly stood up to the crown prince as an equal. The so-called fight for the heir was actually directed at him first. The major events in Jingdo during this half a year seemed to have nothing to do with the second prince. After the eldest princess was placed under house arrest, nothing happened to the second prince. Instead, it was the crown prince who had been exiled by the emperor. Now that the crown prince had been deposed, logically speaking, the second prince should be the one to benefit the most. It was reasonable for him to take action. Even if he wanted to avoid suspicion and gain the emperor's favor by adhering to filial piety and remaining silent, he had actually personally written to defend the crown prince in the Northern Expedition Army winter jacket case and secretly mobilized officials in his faction to stand against the emperor's intentions. Of course, his power in court had basically been shattered by Fan Xian's 2 campaigns. After operating for so many years, he still had some mouths to speak. Most importantly, after he married Yi Ling-er, it was as if he had become half a master of the Yi family. His words on behalf of the crown prince were indeed useful. The crown prince's 2 brothers, 2 of his greatest enemies, used different methods to express their support during the crown prince's most dangerous time. This was truly a wondrous, wonderful, and mysterious situation. Presumably, the Qing emperor's emotions at this time were very complicated. Before the matter of deposing the heir had reached its climax, a climax had already occurred on one of the 3 most dangerous borders in the world. It shocked the already anxious Qing officials into excitement. The 3 most dangerous borders were the border between northern Qi and the northern Man, the border between the Qing kingdom and Shi Hu, and the border between the Qing kingdom and northern Qi. In the extreme north, there had been 3 consecutive years of snowstorms. The frozen northern Man cattle and horses died. They had no choice but to move around the sky. After tens of thousands of li of bitter battle, they finally circled around from the north of northern Qi to the west of the Qing kingdom. However, they paid the tragic price of 70 to 80% of their entire population. This was a major event in history. For the present world, it had a far-reaching effect. First of all, the northern Qi people no longer had to worry about the tall and barbaric barbarians behind them. They could finally free up a hand to deal with the Qing people in the south. That hand was the famous General Shang Shanhu. After Shi Hu used 2 years to digest the northern Man who came to join them, their strength suddenly increased. Although there were not many northern Man survivors, those who could endure tens of thousands of li of travel without food or medicine were all elite young men and women picked out from thousands of li. The Qing kingdom was attacked from both front and back. The pressure increased dramatically. Only then did the Dingzhou Yi family send emergency reinforcements to the Western Front. King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing, was playing hide-and-seek with the Hu people in the west. In the north, Yan Xiaoi had also returned to camp early. He used his powerful military power to suppress Shang Shanhu's strategy and the northern Qi people's bad ideas. The climax of the border this time erupted on the northern front, between the northern governor Yan Xiaoi and the famous general Shang Shanhu. When Shang Shanhu led the army back and gave Yan Xiaoi time to think and prepare, Yan Xiaoi did not even think about his path of retreat in the Qing kingdom or prepare to receive the Qing emperor's arrest. He directly led the army north. With 20,000 elite soldiers, he followed Sangzhou and Yanjing and attacked the northern camp. There was never too much deception in war. The power of the army was like a hurricane. Yan Xiaoi carried out this principle perfectly. Without asking the Bureau of Military Affairs or waiting for the Qing Emperor's edict, he personally led the army and attacked. Shang Shanhu, who had always calculated everything on the battlefield, clearly did not expect that Yan Xiaoi would still have the mind to send out troops to attack when he could not even protect himself. The northern Qi army was slowly retreating 50 li. Before they could set up camp, they were suddenly attacked in the night and suffered heavy losses. The Qing kingdom army had only paid with 5,000 lives. It was a great victory in Sangzhou. In people's impression, this seemed to be the first time Shang Shanhu had lost a battle. When the news got back to Jingdou, regardless of whether it was Shu the scholar, who had been ordered to rest, or the common people selling alcohol on the streets, they all became excited. The desire to fight and the passion to expand the borders buried deep in the Qing people's blood was stirred to its peak by this shameless great victory. The black cloud that had been floating above Jingdou did not seem so piercing. Everyone thought that with such great news, the emperor would not continue to persist in his absurdity and do things contrary to people's emotions. It was truly not a good choice. Following the arrival of the battle report was the northern Qi emperor's letter. In the letter, the northern Qi emperor cursed angrily, saying that the two countries were on good terms, yet they were so shameless. After receiving the letter, the Qing emperor only smiled and handed the matter to the office of the Grand Herald and the Board of Rights to handle. In today's world, the boundaries between countries were always so vague. It was always hard to say who entered whose territory. If it was really a misunderstanding, he could apologize in a few days. In any case, the person who was killed could not come back to life. The emperor smiled slightly at eunuch Hong beside him and said, "Yan Xiaoi is not bad. He knows to use the correct method to explain to me the meaning of his existence. Yes, people who had no meaning of existence should not continue to exist. For example, the Crown Prince." Thus, the Supreme Court continued to interrogate the Winter Jacket case. The Overwatch Council continued to dig up all of the Crown Prince's wrongdoings. The most shameless was the Eighth Bureau. It seemed that they were preparing to write a memoir of the Crown Prince's teasing of serving girls as a child. The matter of deposing the heir did not stop because of Yan Xiaoi's great victory. It only rested for a while. Under the disappointed gazes of the officials, it slowly and unquestionably proceeded. None of this had anything to do with Fan Xian. He was on a civilian boat, looking at the council report in his hand in a daze. He thought to himself that the emperor was indeed more shameless than him. It looked like in a few days, the worship Xue Qing had once mentioned would begin. He wondered what the quiet Qing temple in Jingdou would be like at that time. To find a reason to depose the crown prince, and then worship heaven for an edict. The emperor was the son of heaven. Naturally, the crown prince was heaven's grandson. If heaven thought this grandson was not obedient, then heaven's son could only do as he was told. If this was written, it would be much more beautiful in the history books. It was truly shameless to the extreme. Fan Xian shook his head and put down the council report. Ever since Xue Qing began to write, he had fled Suzhou. He had not returned to Hangzhou or Wuzhou. He had only disguised himself as a commoner and boarded a civilian boat. Unconsciously, He wanted to get as far away from this political whirlpool as possible. He also knew about the second prince writing to protect the crown prince. He thought to himself that the second prince's heart was truly ruthless. Chapter 5:18. There are still 80 votes from the top 3. Everyone, good luck. I also do my best. It seems to be reaching the climax. I am a bit panicked. Fan Xian was not running. He was running away. In any case, he was walking away from Jiangnan, Jingdou, and the heart of the political storm in the Qing kingdom. He knew that no matter how the situation in Jingdou developed, the emperor had already made up his mind. No one could stop the matter of deposing the heir. Since it was so, any further action he took would be superfluous. Furthermore, he was worried that when the emperor prayed to heaven, he would drag him back to Jingdou and place him in front of him as a human shield. The crown prince had been deposed. There would certainly be a lot of turbulence in the court. No matter how Fan Xian calculated, the emperor would certainly have him carry out a clash with those turbulence and restabilize the balance of the court. During this period of time, his mood had always been low. Just as mentioned earlier, questions concerning life always floated back and forth in his mind. He did not have the energy to pay attention to these things. He knew that at a time like this, the further he ran, the smarter he was. Furthermore, each time he thought of the Qing emperor making such a decision in that beautiful and lonely Qing temple, Fan Xian felt strange and uncomfortable in his heart. That temple was where he and Lin Wanner had first met. It was where he and his wife had pledged their love. Now, it had become a place to fight for power. It was very annoying. Thus, he chose to stay far away. When Yan Xiaoi led tens of thousands of elite soldiers straight toward the north camp to carry out a night attack, Fan Xian also boarded a large ship on a slightly stuffy night and headed straight from Hangzhou to the sea. He planned to circle around the rising and falling coastline of the Qing kingdom's east and carry out a peaceful journey. This time, he left before the emperor's edict arrived. He also didn't inform Xueqing and carried it out in secret. Fan Xian did not want to participate in this matter again, so he ran with great determination. If the Qing emperor found out that the edict he had summoned for him could not be delivered, he might be angry, but he could not blame him. He was the imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road and needed to sit in the yamen. The only place he needed to sit in the yamen was in the palace treasury. His trip in disguise this time was in the name of inspecting the palace treasury's eastern road. However, his destination was Danzhou. He had 2 goals in returning to Danzhou. One was to see his grandmother. The housekeeper in the Danzhou manor had sent a letter saying that his grandmother's health had not been well recently. This made him very worried. Secondly, he wanted to ask for her opinion on the complicated situation in the Qing kingdom and the world. Ever since he was a child, he had grown up beside his grandmother in Danzhou and received her teachings. Whenever the tense became chaotic and uncontrollable, he would always unconsciously ask for her guidance. Perhaps his grandmother could not help him much, but at least she could calm his heart. The ship left the harbor and advanced with all its might towards the rising sun in the east. Fan Xian only had time to admire the majestic scenery before returning to the cabin. He sat next to the large chest of silver, tilted his head, and began to count. He was counting the Zhangzhou victory report in the council report. No matter how Fan Xian counted, he did not feel that there was anything wrong with the victory. It was just that the timing of the battle or local battles was a bit strange. He furrowed his brows. These days, he had already begun to make arrangements. Once the situation in the Qing kingdom was settled, how he should handle it, whether or not he should give up the Overwatch Council, and how the emperor would arrange for him. But as he thought about it carefully, he always felt that he was thinking too early. When the cunning rabbit died, even if the dog didn't enter the pot, there wouldn't be much meat to eat. The problem now was that not only was the cunning rabbit not dead, it had also been overly well-behaved. Accurately speaking, as long as the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, did not die, Fan Xian did not think this matter would come to a complete end. After a few more days, the matter of deposing the heir in Jingdo should have reached its final stages. Fan Xian was alone on the ocean and did not know the progress of the matter. Because he didn't want to accept an imperial edict, he even had the ship temporarily cut off contact with the Overwatch Council's intelligence system. Like a black, anti-radar aircraft, he floated alone on the ocean. The ship arrived in a small city on Jiangbei Road. The civilian ship he was on was modified from the Overwatch Council's military ship. Normal people would not be able to see anything wrong with it. He had thought that on the way back to Danzhou, he would not attract any attention. Unexpectedly, the officials in that small town respectfully delivered generous gifts, and without requesting to meet them, they withdrew on their own accord. Fan Xian was a bit confused. He wondered how this minor official had guessed he was on the ship. Wang Qinian smiled and said, "You are too imposing." This flattery was too poor, so Fan Xian expressed his dissatisfaction. He turned his gaze to the other man with the surname Wang. 13th Wang glanced at him and shrugged. "Who knows? It seems to me that you're quite happy to receive the gift." Fan Xian was not happy that he had seen through his vain side. 13th Wang laughed heartily and walked to the side of the ship. Holding the green banner in his hand, it was like a small sail. It appeared very comical. The most important thing in officialdom was to exchange information. The officials in the small city knew that the commissioner of the Overwatch Council was on the ship. Thus, all the officials in the provinces along the coast knew of this news. From that day on, the ship followed the coastline north. Every time it stopped, local officials would come forward to give gift. They all seemed to guess that Fan Xian did not want to see them, so they did not ask to meet. After traveling and stopping for a dozen days, 14 groups of people came on the ship to give gifts and greetings. Fan Xian sat at the head of the ship and looked at the large piece of green jade that brushed past him. It was the Dong Mountain that had been cut in half by the heavenly sword. He was still lost in thought. How had his movements been completely discovered by others? In any case, he was getting further and further away from Jingdo and the Emperor. Fan Xian's mood became more and more relaxed. On the contrary, he was slightly intoxicated by the scenery along the way and the scene of the officials waiting on him like grandsons. In another world within another world, there was once a drunkard named Linghu who had taken a boat on the Yellow River. He had muddle-headedly received countless large gifts, received countless verbal benefits, and suffered physical pain. Presumably, that eldest disciple's vanity had been greatly satisfied, especially in front of those shameless junior brothers and junior sisters. Fan Xian had taken a boat on the East Sea and also muddle-headedly received countless large gifts. Although no one dared to disturb him, his vanity had been satisfied to a certain extent. Particularly when Jingdo was in the midst of a storm, he was able to float on a boat on the sea. The wind of the great path was swift. This kind of feeling was very pleasing, even if this kind of pleasure was only temporary. After the boat passed the isolated seaside and the great Dong Mountain that pierced the sky like a half-jade sword, it made 2 more turns. When the temple at the top of the mountain could no longer be seen, it was nearing Danzhou harbor. This was the second time Fan Xian had taken this sea route. He did not have the same impact as the first time he had on the strange and majestic Great Dong Mountain. However, he still felt his heart tremble slightly. The large boat anchored in Danzhou harbor. No officials came to welcome them. Fan Xian let out a breath. Taking Gouda and a few other tiger guards and 6th Bureau swordsmen, he arrived at the door of the old Danzhou manor amidst the burning gazes and endless greetings of the Danzhou people. Fan Xian smiled slightly and thought, hadn't he just come back a year ago? Why were these people still so warm and excited? He stretched out his hand and knocked on the familiar wooden door of the old manor. Just as his finger landed on the door, he furrowed his brows. He could clearly feel countless wary gazes focused on him from all around the manor. However, the owners of these gazes clearly knew how to hide their bodies. For a short time, he did not discover exactly where they were. The countless auras, bright and dark, were filled with a suffocating pressure. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and bent his knees slightly. His left hand gripped the trigger of the crossbow in his sleeve. His right hand hung naturally, ready at any moment to grab the slender black dagger in his boot. At his side, Wang Qinyan's expression did not change. He held the Wei Emperor's sword horizontally. The body of the sword was half exposed and glimmered with a cold light. The hilt was where Fan Xian could most easily reach out and pull it out. 13th Wang's gaze was lowered as he held the green banner tightly. The Tiger Guards, led by Gouda, also sensed the abnormality. Their brows furrowed slightly as their hands gripped the hilts of their long knives. Only the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council reacted slightly slower. They had been scattered around the commissioner the entire time. Suddenly encountering an enemy, they naturally moved their bodies closer to the shops on the side of the street. Using the darkness of the buildings, they were ready at any moment to dive into the darkness and carry out the most direct conflict with the hidden enemies. Fan Xian was a person who was very afraid of death. Although he did not bring many people, they were all the most powerful in the world. In the past, he had the Shadow and Haitang as the vanguard. Now, he had 13th Wang as the fierce warrior. Added to himself, the Tiger Guards and the swordsmen with such a powerful defensive power, even if a great grandmaster came, Fan Xian was confident that he could hold out for a few rounds. In other words, he had always been ready to receive the assassination of a great grandmaster. However, outside the old Danzhou manor, Fan Xian felt a sense of pressure from the people hidden around him despite the powerful power around him. Furthermore, this pressure came from one person. This proved that the person who came was not a great grandmaster. Who else in this world could gather so many aces? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and suddenly smiled bitterly. The wooden door of the old Danzhou manor was slowly pulled open. Following a creak, the tense atmosphere immediately disappeared. A familiar face appeared behind the door, but this face should not have appeared in Danzhou. Sir Ren. Fan Xian looked at Taichung Temple official Ren Xiao and inside the manor and smiled bitterly. Why are you waiting for me in my home? Ren Xiao unsmiled but did not greet him. Instead, he made a gesture of invitation. Fan Xian paused slightly and turned his head to glance at 13th Wang. 13th Wang smiled and stayed outside the manor with the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian led Wang Qinian, Gouda, and the others toward the old manor. Along the way, they did not find anything strange. However, they could feel that this usually quiet and secluded courtyard was now filled with a sense of tension. No one knew how many aces were hidden behind the trees and behind the walls. Walking to the door of the back courtyard, Ren Xiao unstopped his steps. A eunuch welcomed Fan Xian in with a face full of smiles. The smile on Fan Xian's face grew more bitter. He looked at eunuch Yao speechlessly for a long time. Walking to the little building in the back courtyard, a few officials were waiting quietly on the first floor. Seeing Fan Xian enter, they all rose and bowed. Fan Xian returned each of their greetings. He recognized the Minister of the Board of Rites and the Imperial Astronomer. Eunuch Yao walked him to the first floor. Fan Xian picked up the front of his robe and walked with heavy steps toward the second floor. His grandmother lived on the second floor. Lifting the beaded curtain outside the second floor, Fan Xian walked steadily in. Looking at his sickly grandmother on the couch, a glimmer of heartache flashed across his face. Looking at the middle-aged man holding his grandmother's hand and talking by the couch, a glimmer of fear flashed through his heart. He walked to the front of the couch and knelt down obediently. Kowtowing to the two of them, he then forced a smile and said, "Your Majesty, why are you here?" Fan Xian's heart was filled with shock and helplessness. This time, he had left Hangzhou for Danzhou and taken in the sights along the way. He had thought he would be as free and at ease as his eldest disciple brother, waving his sleeves and throwing the matter of dethroning the heir to the back of his mind. He had not thought that his teacher, Yu Buchuan, would be waiting for him here. "Am I not allowed to come?" The Emperor looked at Fan Xian with a difficult-to-understand smile on his face. Slowly, he said, "You are an imperial envoy, yet you have come to Danzhou on business. I remember that I only gave you authority over Jiangnan Road. I didn't tell you to manage the matters of Dongshan Road." Fan Xian said with a pained expression, "It was mainly to check on the palace treasury's East Road. After passing Jiangbei Road, I thought it was not far from Danzhou, so I came to see grandmother. I heard that she was not well." As her grandson, before he finished speaking, the Emperor cut him off angrily. "Filial piety is not something that can be used as an excuse. Run, I want to see where else you can run to." Fan Xian was dumbfounded. He thought, "You want to dethrone the crown prince. I just don't want to participate. There is no need for you to be so angry, right?" However, he had boundless confusion and worry in his heart. He was not stupid enough to argue with the Emperor. He smiled and said, "I am an ant in your Majesty's hand. No matter how I run, I cannot escape the palm of your hand." This flattery clearly did not change the Emperor's mood. However, the Emperor did not seem to want to pursue this matter. Lightly, he said, "Since you have come to show filial piety, then quickly come up and have a look. If you can't cure it, I will carefully skin you." After saying this, the Emperor stood and quietly said by the old woman's ear, "Mother, rest well. I will come see you again tonight." Then, he walked out of the room on the second floor, leaving behind a confused Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed his legs and stood up. He sat down by his grandmother's side and placed his finger on her pulse. A moment later, his body softened and a streak of cold sweat appeared on his back. The old woman smiled slightly and said, "You monkey, aren't you afraid of scaring me like this? My body is fine. You should be afraid of something else." Fan Xian felt guilty and speechless. He was indeed afraid of something else. The Emperor had come to Danzhou without anyone knowing. Wasn't Jingdou an empty palace? At the crucial moment of dethroning the crown prince, why did the Emperor dare to leave Jingdou? Chapter 519. I'm in the top 3. Thank you, everyone. Come on, give me some more monthly vote. Thank you, thank you. Fan Xian sat on the bed and gently held his grandmother's hand. He found that the wrinkles on her hand had deepened. There was a palpitating feeling of being separated from flesh and blood. After taking her pulse, he found that his grandmother had only occasionally caught a cold. Her body was fine. However, she was getting on in years. Her oil was about to run out and her lamp was about to run out. He didn't know how many more years she could endure. Thinking of this, his mood dropped. Adding to the shock brought by the Emperor downstairs, it made him sink into silence. After the second floor was silent for a long time, the old woman sighed and said, "Just what are you worried about?" "I don't know how I'm going to walk my path in the future." Fan Xian looked at his grandmother's serious face and smiled slightly. He knew that under his grandmother's serious face hid a gentle heart. "You've walked well these few years." The old woman's voice was lowered slightly. Although the people downstairs certainly couldn't hear their conversation, she smiled amiably and rubbed Fan Xian's head. She smiled kindly and rubbed Fan Xian's head. Her tone and expression both revealed a sense of pride and relief. Given the position and reputation Fan Xian had obtained these 3 years, the old woman, who had single-handedly taught this grandson, had enough reason to be proud. Half of a 100-li journey is 90 li. Fan Xian patted his head self-mockingly. I'm just afraid my head will suddenly fall off halfway. The old woman looked calmly at her grandson. A moment later, she gently said, Did the Emperor's arrival in Danzhou make you have some inauspicious thoughts? Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a long time. He confirmed what the emotions that had spontaneously risen in him earlier were. He then nodded his head solemnly. The old woman looked into his eyes and quietly said, You've grown up, but there are some things I must remind you of. Please speak, grandmother. The Fan family has never needed to pick a side, and you, even less need to pick a side because we have always stood in front of the Emperor, the old woman said solemnly and seriously. The old lady said seriously, As long as you can guarantee this, then you will never make a mistake. There were countless meanings hidden in these words, but they were all built on the strongest foundation of trust in the Emperor. Fan Xian glanced at his grandmother with some confusion but didn't dare to ask. There's no need to doubt what has been proven in the past 30 years. Fan Xian did not think this way. He believed that what history had proven would often be overturned by the future. He thought for a bit and then said, But, under these circumstances, it is truly too risky for the Emperor to leave Jingdou. Are you going to remonstrate later? The old mistress looked at her grandson with a faint smile. Fan Xian thought for a moment, then nodded. We should still be able to make it if we rush back now. In reality, these words were just empty words. He knew that since the Emperor had come to Danzhou at this time, he must have very important thoughts in his heart. It was not something he could chase away with just a few words. However, as an official, particularly one who had to pretend to be a loyal and filial son, there were some things he had to say in person. The Madame Dowager smiled and said, Then you should go. Otherwise, His Majesty will be impatient. Fan Xian also smiled but didn't leave immediately. He carefully used the Zhenqi of Tianyi Dao to probe into his grandmother's body to check the condition of her body. He left behind a few prescriptions and chatted with her for a while until she began to feel sleepy. Only then did he help her pull up the thin towel and tiptoed down the stairs. Coming down to the first floor, the Minister of the Board of Rites, the Imperial Astronomer, and Eunuch Yao all looked at Fan Xian with strange gazes. These people had not thought that Sir Fan Jr. would be so daring as to stay on the second floor for so long and leave the Emperor, who had been waiting to speak with him, hanging for half a day. In this world, Fan Xian was probably the only person who dared to make the Qing Emperor wait for so long. These bigwigs were all thinking that His Majesty's love for this illegitimate child had indeed reached a very exaggerated level. Fan Xian bowed to these people and asked with a slight smile, Where is the Emperor? The Minister of the Board of Rites forced a smile and glanced outside, pointing the way for him. Eunuch Yao suppressed a smile and led Fan Xian out the door. Looking at the osmanthus flowers in the garden. Danzhou was most famous for its scented tea. Minister Fan and Fan Xian both liked it. Every year, the old manor would send it to Jingdou. A portion of it was even offered as a tribute to the palace. Although the garden in the old manor was not large, Fan Xian had partitioned off a corner and planted some osmanthus flowers to mix with tea. Walking to the corner of the garden, Eunuch Yao retreated with his body hunched. Fan Xian felt it was strange. The head eunuch of the royal study was not at the Emperor's side to serve. Why had he run off? As he thought this, he had already stepped into the garden and saw the Emperor under the tree. There was also the old man by the Emperor's side. Fan Xian secretly sucked in a breath of cold air. No wonder Eunuch Yao didn't have to be by the Emperor's side. There was another eunuch at his side. He walked forward and bowed to the Emperor. At the same time, he turned his body and said to the eunuch as politely and not abruptly as possible, Greetings, Eunuch Hong. Expressing goodwill to a eunuch in front of the Emperor was something that should not have happened, but Fan Xian knew that Eunuch Hong was not a normal person. However, Fan Xian knew that Eunuch Hong was no ordinary person. Even the Emperor would give him some respect. Greeting him should not mean much. Hong Xiang smiled slightly and glanced at Fan Xian. He didn't say anything and retreated behind the emperor. The emperor moved his gaze from the osmanthus tree in the garden and clapped his hands. Turning his head, he said to Fan Xian, "I heard you moved these trees in and planted them?" Fan Xian replied, "Yes, the old manor's garden is not large. Previously, there weren't many trees planted inside. It looked rather boring, particularly in the spring and summer. There are tall trees and bushes of flowers outside, but it is too quiet inside, so I moved a few." "Looks like you have some interest, child," the emperor smiled. The emperor smiled and said, "Back then, when I lived in this courtyard, there were also trees. However, they were all broken by my people who practiced martial arts." Fan Xian was speechless. He had lived in this manor for 16 years, but he had never known that the emperor had once lived here. The old woman's mouth was truly tight shut. He suddenly thought of the past that his father and King Jing had once mentioned. Back then, the emperor had once taken Chen Pingping and his father to Danzhou to play. At that time, the emperor was still an unknown heir. It was in Danzhou that they had met his mother and Uncle Wu Zhu. Looking at it this way, when the emperor lived in the old manor, it was also the moment the wheel of history began to turn. As he strolled around the garden and chatted idly with the emperor, Fan Xian's mood gradually became anxious. He didn't know what opportunity he should find to open his mouth and urge the emperor to hurry back to the capital. The expression on his face began to appear unnatural. "I am not in plain clothes." Seeming to guess what Fan Xian was thinking, the emperor said with slight mockery, 3 days after I left Jingdou, I announced it to the world, so don't worry too much." Fan Xian opened his eyes wide and asked in shock, "Your Majesty, everyone knows you have come to Danzhou?" "Wrong, everyone knows I am going to worship heaven." The emperor glanced at him, put his hands behind his back, and walked first out of the garden. Fan Xian glanced at Eunuch Hong with some confusion, and quickly followed. Following behind the emperor, he asked, "Your Majesty, why did I not know of this matter?" The emperor did not stop walking. Smiling coldly, he said, "Imperial envoy, you were having fun on the sea. How could you have received the edict I sent to Hangzhou?" Fan Xian was greatly embarrassed and didn't reply. The emperor paused and then angrily said, "You are, after all, an imperial envoy. How could you leave your post without permission?" "I have already given the edict for you to meet up with the group worshipping heaven. When you return to Hangzhou in the future, walk through these procedures." After Fan Xian's great embarrassment, he was slightly surprised. The emperor's edict had long been announced to the world for him, an imperial envoy, to join the group worshipping heaven. No wonder the officials along the coast had guessed the people on the ship. However, the emperor's words earlier were clearly to protect him. It looked like after the Jingdou matter had passed a few months ago, the emperor's mood did not seem so bad. Seeing the emperor's footsteps step out of the old manor's wooden door, the guards hidden in the shadows and officials in the courtyard all followed out. For a moment, the scene was incomparably lively. Fan Xian couldn't resist any more and caught up a few steps. Lowering his voice, he said, "Your Majesty, the situation in Jingdou is not yet settled. Since it is time to worship heaven, I will escort your Majesty back to the capital." The emperor stopped his steps and turned his head to glance at him with amusement. "Since it is to worship heaven, why do we have to return to the capital?" Fan Xian replied, "Naturally, it is in the Qing temple." "There is more than one Qing temple," the emperor said lightly. "There is also a temple on Dong Mountain." Fan Xian's heart jumped. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The emperor had traveled thousands of li to Dong Mountain to worship heaven. No wonder there were very few scholars and officials among the servants with him. Instead, it was the minister of the Board of Rites, Taichung Temple, and the imperial astronomer who followed. Worshipping heaven and deposing the heir indeed needed these people. Why wasn't this done in Jingdou? Why had it come to the shores of the East Sea? Was the Emperor not worried at all? I know what you are worried about. The Emperor's expression was slightly gentle. It was as if he felt that his son was always thinking about his father's safety. His heart was praiseworthy. After thinking for a bit, he smiled slightly and said, "Since you are unable to control your worry, then I will leave my safety in your hands." Fan Xian was surprised again and repeatedly smiled bitterly. He wondered why he had taken on such a difficult task. At this time, he could not refuse and could only give thanks and agree. In a moment, come see me on the dock. The Emperor knew what Fan Xian was going to do next. After saying this, he and Eunuch Hong left the manor and climbed into the carriage. Eunuch Yao, along with a group of servants and officials, also followed out. Fan Xian stood at the manor door and looked at the slightly changing light around him on the street. He knew that the Tiger Guards and the Overwatch Council swordsmen accompanying the Emperor had already followed. He relaxed slightly. He waved his hand. Wang Qinian ran over from the other side of the street. With a face full of astonishment, he said to Fan Xian, "Sir, the person who went earlier was..." Fan Xian nodded. Wang Qinian swallowed his saliva with great difficulty and said in a low voice, "Why is this master here?" Fan Xian's expression darkened slightly. He muttered, "No one knows why. I only know that if something happens to him, I'm done for." If something happened to the Emperor during the process of worshipping heaven, Fan Xian, as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and now with the heavy responsibility of being a bodyguard, would die a wretched death. At least, the people in Jingdo would certainly put this black pot on Fan Xian's head while they would sit on the chair with a smile. Fan Xian clenched his fist and smiled bitterly in self-mockery. "I don't want to be Sigujian. Send down an order. Have all of the people in the council stationed in East Shandong Road move out. Be alert. If anyone comes within 50 li of Dong Mountain, send a first-level report." Wang Qinian acknowledged. Fan Xian continued, "Send the order to Jiangbei. Have Jinggu take 500 Black Knights and rush through the night to reinforce Dongshan Road. Set up defenses along the northwest line and coordinate with the local provincial army. Make sure there are no problems. If there is any strange movement, kill without mercy." Wang Qinian raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian. The northwest direction of Dongshan Road led directly to Yanjing and Sangzhou. It was where Governor Yan Xiaoi's camp was. However, the two places were very far apart. If Yan Xiaoi truly had the courage to rebel and kill the Emperor, he would not have been able to move his army so far away without alerting the court. "Being careful is always the best strategy," Fan Xian said with his head down. He was incomparably angry in his heart. Who knew how many people the Emperor was going to frighten by doing this? Wang Qinian accepted the order and left. A man in cloth clothing walked to Fan Xian's side and bowed. "By the Emperor's edict, please give your orders." Fan Xian glanced at this person and warmly said, "Deputy Commander, you are more familiar with the Emperor's personal defense. If there is anything inappropriate, we can discuss it again." The security of the Qing royal palace was handled by the Imperial Army and the palace guards. The two systems were basically the same. A few years ago, the commander of the palace guards was Yan Xiaoi. The deputy commander was Gong Dian, who led the Imperial Army and guards. In the 5th year of the Qing calendar, after Fan Xian's night infiltration of the royal palace, the security arrangements of the royal palace underwent a major change. Yan Xiaoi was transferred to the position of governor of the north. The Imperial Army and guards were split into two. Presently, the Great Prince was in charge of the Imperial Army, while the guards within the palace were under Eunuch Yao's control. The person speaking to Fan Xian was the Great Prince's deputy, the deputy commander of the Imperial Army. Fan Xian had to be more polite when speaking to him, but he didn't waste time on pleasantries. Straightforwardly, he asked, "How many people from the Imperial Army have come?" 2,000, the deputy commander of the Imperial Army replied respectfully. They are all outside Danzhou to receive orders. Fan Xian nodded. He thought to himself that with 2,000 Imperial soldiers, in addition to the numerous aces at the Emperor's side, the problem of safety should be guaranteed. He turned his head to glance at the two-story building faintly visible in the corner of the old manor and was slightly lost in thought. He remembered the first time he left Danzhou. His grandmother had once told him to harden his heart. At the same time, she had once said that his mother had died an unnatural death because she was too gentle. In that instant, Fan Xian thought of the words his grandmother had said to him as she held him and the faint truth. Suddenly, his heart jumped. However, he immediately suppressed it and shook his head with a sigh. Eunuch Hong was unfathomable by the Emperor's side. Uncle Wu Zhu was not by his side. The Shadow and Haitang were also not here. Even with 13th Wang, their power was not strong enough. Furthermore, he was far away in Danzhou and had no way of controlling the movements in Jingdou. Most importantly, Fan Xian had to admit that up until now, the Emperor had treated him fairly well. He laughed self-deprecatingly, trying to banish the thought from his mind. The deputy commander of the Imperial Army did not know that he was thinking of treasonous things. He thought that Sir Fan Jr. was worried about the Emperor's safety, so he had to say a few words of advice and pat his chest to express his confidence. On the Danzhou dock, the common people watching had long been chased out of sight. The fishing boats coming and going had long returned to their respective ports. The entire city seemed to have become incomparably oppressive and respectful because of the arrival of the middle-aged man in a light yellow robe on the dock. Only the floating clouds in the sky, the foam in the sea, and the seagulls flying between the sky and water did not seem to feel this kind of pressure. They continued to float and fly freely. The birds searched for food on the sea and gave out sharp cries, startling the Emperor who was deep in thought on the dock. He beckoned his hand behind him and said, "Come to my side." Fan Xian, who had been watching the Emperor's figure from below the wooden dock, heard these words and jumped onto the wooden plank. He walked to the Emperor's side and slightly behind him. Facing forward, he looked at the boundless ocean. "Take another step forward." The Emperor held his hands behind his back and did not turn his head. Fan Xian followed the order and took another step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Emperor. The sea breeze blew the hair by the side of the Emperor's face back. There was no sense of gentleness. On the contrary, it gave off a sense of determination that made one's heart tremble. Below his feet, the waves were beating against the rocks under the wooden plank, turning into one snowflake, two snowflakes, and countless snowflakes. "Stick out your chest." The Emperor's eyes looked at the end of the ocean and said to Fan Xian beside him, "I don't like you pretending to be a coward." Fan Xian smiled slightly. He understood the Emperor's current state of mind. He followed the words and relaxed. Standing shoulder to shoulder with him, he did not open his mouth to speak. "The last time I came to Danzhou, I wasn't even the crown prince," the Emperor slowly said. The Emperor slowly said, "That day, Chen Pingping was like Hong Xiang standing behind me. Your father, Fan Jian, was like you now, standing side by side with me, bathing in the exceptionally clear sea breeze of Danzhou. Ever since I became the crown prince, Fan Jian never dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me again." Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and saw a glimmer of self-mockery flash across the corner of the Emperor's lips. The Emperor said with slight mockery, "After I sit on that chair and fight in the north and south, there won't be anyone who dares to stand up straight and talk to me, much less stand up." Fan Xian sighed at just the right time. That day the three of us came to Danzhou to relax. At that time, Jingdou was in chaos. The two princes were secretly fighting for the throne. The previous emperor was only the unremarkable King Qing, the Emperor said indifferently. As juniors, we had no way of interfering. We could only hide as far away as possible from the place of trouble. He tilted his head and glanced at Fan Xian. In reality, my thoughts are similar to yours. However, you are much more powerful than I was in the past. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, most importantly, the heart is not strong enough. There are some things that one does not know how to face. Who would have thought that you would have some pity for Qingqian? The emperor turned his head and coldly said, however, this is good. Back then, the three of us stood on this dock and looked at the ocean. There was no pity in our hearts for anyone. We only thought about how to protect ourselves and how to survive. I often think that when I looked at the ocean that day, perhaps I was hoping that an immortal would suddenly appear on the ocean. Fan Xian was silent. He knew what the emperor would say next. There was nothing on the ocean, just like today, the emperor said slowly. A glimmer of a smile once again rose to the corners of his lips. However, when we turned our heads, we found that there was another woman on the dock, as well as her strange servant. Fan Xian slowly said with yearning, actually, I have always wondered how you met my mother back then. The emperor's body shook slightly. He was slightly shaken by Fan Xian's sudden Only then did he realize that this kid had unconsciously said it. Involuntarily, the glimmer of a gratified smile appeared at the corners of his lips. However, he did not continue this topic. He only said, I told you earlier, no one has ever dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Only your mother dared. Regardless of whether she was the crown prince or the emperor, your mother dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. She looked at the ocean and felt the sea breeze. She did not treat me as someone special at all. Sometimes, she would even look down on me without holding back. The emperor smiled self-mockingly and said, after she died, there was no longer such a person in this world. I don't expect you to inherit much of what she did. I just feel that you shouldn't be too cowardly and damage my and your mother's prestige for no reason. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and thought, this is because you are looking after the past and the present, which is why you allowed me to stand for a while. As for prestige, forget it. My life is more important. Your Majesty, let's return to the capital. Fan Xian finally said what he wanted to say. With a slightly worried expression, he said, leaving the capital for too long is always. Seeing that he wanted to say something but then stopped, the emperor coldly said, say everything you want to say. You just want to say that you're afraid that someone will take advantage of my absence to have ill intentions. Chapter 520. Last night, the heaviest rainstorm the city has seen in 10 years hit. It looks spectacular, but I hope it won't be affected. Today, this chapter is easy but important. The next volume will invite everyone to come back and read this chapter. P.S. Today is the day of the college entrance examination. I wish the children participating in the exam all the best. Birds chirped by the seaside, the water splashed gently under the pier, and the waves at the bottom of the cliff in the distance made loud noises. Fan Xian stood on the wooden board and was not confused by the emperor's hot-blooded words. Seriously, he said, as the ruler of 10,000 years, he will not enter an unpredictable place. I ask that you return to the capital. The capital is guarded by the Empress Dowager, Chun Pingping, and the 2 scholars. Who dares to make a move? The emperor gazed at the ocean and impatiently waved his hand. If they want to take over the world, they have to take over that chair. First, they have to kill me, who is sitting on the chair. If they can't kill me, let them do as they please. Trash rebelling won't succeed in 10 years. Fan Xian was silent and speechless. He thought to himself that this emperor was truly a strange person. His incomparably powerful self-confidence and intense paranoia mixed together created this person's extremely narcissistic personality. The emperor wanted to draw the snake out of its hole. Perhaps one day he would die from his narcissism. The problem was that Fan Xian did not want to be buried with him. And you have to know that it's very difficult to see through a person's heart. The emperor suddenly sighed emotionally. No one knew if he was talking about his son or his sister. After this rare sigh, a layer of tiredness suddenly covered his expression. The wrinkles on his brows were filled with an indescribable tiredness. This tiredness was not the kind of tiredness he deliberately put on for his officials to see when he sat on the dragon throne in the royal court. It was true tiredness, a kind of weariness that arose from the depths of his heart. Fan Xian stood to the side and calmly studied the emperor's expression. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind. This was the first time he had seen such a real and intimate expression on the emperor's face. However, this true display of emotion was like the clouds above the Danzhou seaport. It only occasionally bloomed and blocked the blinding sunlight. It immediately drifted away and transformed into the porcelain blue sky. After a moment, there was no longer any trace of it on the emperor's face. What was left was only the radiant confidence and perseverance. Occasionally revealing his mortal heart, that person immediately returned to the role of a king. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian could not help but feel a little emotional. He sighed and said, "It is said that it is difficult to draw the bones of a tiger when drawing a person. One may know a person for a long time, but one does not know their heart. Usually they are gentle to each other, but who knows if there will be a day when they will take two straight knives and stab each other in the chest." It was clear that the emperor did not care who Fan Xian was sighing at. He was just thinking about the past while surrounded by these emotions. He stared blankly at the sea and said, "The world may think that I am a heartless person, but they are all wrong." Fan Xian quietly watched the emperor from the side and did not reply. The emperor slowly said, "I have given them too many chances, hoping that they would suddenly repent. Even now I am still giving them chances. If it were not for love, why would I need to rush about like this?" Fan Xian thought to himself, seducing and forcing people to make mistakes to test their hearts. Looking closely at the crown prince and second princes suffering these years, was the emperor's actions like this out of love or out of his mind? "Just like your mother." The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly as if he felt that the sun floating through the clouds was too piercing. Fan Xian's heart tightened slightly as he carefully listened to every word the emperor said. The emperor glanced at him and then turned his face away. Faintly, he said, "She has done a great service to the Qin kingdom. For me, it can be said that my kindness is greater than the heavens." However, with a sudden change, she and her Yi family became a thing of the past and suffered a tragic death. Yet, I remained hidden and did not do anything. Although I later made up for it a little, compared to her kindness, I did very little. Fan Xian understood what he meant. After his mother passed away, the emperor had endured for 4 years before he caught all the nobles in Jingdou involved in the matter in one fell swoop. However, he had left a few important people unkilled. If this was revenge was not complete. The emperor faintly said, "I did not say it, and the two of them did not ask. However, I know that they are all dissatisfied in their hearts and have resentment toward me." A glimmer of self-mockery suddenly rose to the corners of his lips. "But what could I do in this matter?" Without saying a word, taking the Yi family into the national treasury and accusing the Yi family of treason was heartless. But, if I were to reverse the verdict for the Yi family, what would the Empress Dowager do? Or do I have to depose and kill the Empress in order to be truly loyal? Strangely, even as the Emperor spoke to this point, his tone remained calm without a trace of agitation. It made Fan Xian, who was listening to the side, admire him greatly. Of course, he knew that the so-called they with resentment referred to his father, Fan Jian, and Director Chen Pingping. As an emperor, it is impossible to wander the 4 seas without any hindrances. The emperor calmly said, "If I really did that, I would also be a heartless person. Furthermore, what would the entire court become? I think that if she was alive, she would certainly approve of my actions. She wanted a powerful and prosperous Qin kingdom, and I did it. A determined expression rose to the emperor's face. Looking around, the Qin kingdom is the most powerful country in the world. The people of the Qin kingdom live happier than any other year in history. I think this is enough to comfort her. Fan Xian was silent. In the years after his rebirth, he often asked himself what kind of country the Qin kingdom was and what kind of person the emperor was. Although he had a deeper understanding of all of this after entering the capital and finally touched the emperor's self-confidence, narcissism, arrogance, and masochism, he had to admit one thing. Even with the flood the year before and the snowstorm this year, the efficiency of the Qin kingdom's bureaucracy, the wealth of the people, and the clarity of politics were many times better than the history books he had read in his previous life. In other words, the Qin kingdom was, without question, a peaceful and prosperous world. The emperor by his side was, without question, a wise ruler, even a saint, if the emperor's goal was to let the people eat their fill. She said that the officials of the court needed supervision. When I was still the crown prince, I advised father to establish the Overwatch Council. She said that eunuchs were pitiful and hateful, so I strictly adhered to the rules since the founding of the country and strictly prohibited eunuchs from interfering in politics. At the same time, I ordered the internal court and Taichung Temple to determine the number of eunuchs and do their best to reduce the number of abnormal people in the palace. Fan Xian nodded repeatedly. The number of eunuchs in the Qing royal palace was much less than in northern Qi. This was, without question, a virtuous policy. She said that a wise ruler should be able to listen to advice. All right, I granted the imperial censorate the right to discuss matters. The emperor spoke faster and faster and became more and more lost in thought. Fan Xian couldn't help but bite the tender flesh in his lip, reminding himself not to laugh at the thought of the imperial censorate's buttocks being flogged into streaky meat. She said that there was a need for reform and a need for a root cause. All right, I did as she said. I changed the yuan, changed the system, and carried out new policies. Fan Xian finally couldn't resist smiling bitterly. The yuan was changed in the first year of the Qin calendar. At that time, the change was actually the third new policy. The Ministry of War changed to the Ministry of Military Affairs and then changed to the Bureau of Military Affairs. The Imperial College separated into the Tunwen Pavilion. Later, it was changed to the Ministry of Education and then changed back. Even the names of the 6 ministries from ancient times until now were almost changed by this emperor. The Qing emperor's achievements throughout his life were brilliant and dazzling. However, the 3 new policies in a row were absurd things that he could not avoid in his life. Even now, when the people of Jingdo talked about these yamens, they were still confused. Each time they wanted to go somewhere, they often had to report a number of names. If it weren't for the powerful deterrence of the imperial power and the valiant execution of the Qing officials, which turned the court back to its original appearance and left only those discordant names, the Qing kingdom would probably have long fallen into chaos. The emperor looked at his expression and smiled self-mockingly. You don't have to hide it. I know that this was one of the rare times in my life that I was muddle-headed. However, at that time, your mother was no longer here. I only knew the gist of it. It was hard to avoid making some mistakes. Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. He thought to himself that after his mother died, the emperor still did as he was told. In terms of this intention, it had to be said that the emperor could be considered a sentimental person in this matter. Before your mother passed, I heard a lot from her. Later, I was unable to do anything for her. The emperor closed his eyes and faintly said, After she passed, I remembered all the things she once mentioned to me and wanted to help her realize them. It could be considered some kind of promise or guilt toward her. Fan Xian sighed and said, If my mother was still alive, she would certainly be endlessly grateful for your Majesty's kindness. No, it is not kindness. The emperor opened his eyes and calmly said. The emperor opened his eyes and calmly said, "It is only affection. As for admiration, that is even more impossible. I only want to do some things to honor her spirit in heaven. I do not wish for anything else." The emperor suddenly smiled and said, "Back then, she used a regretful tone to speak of the newspaper. She said there was no gossip to read or interesting news to read. So, I had the internal court make a newspaper and draw some flowers on it. Now that I think about it, I was also very mischievous." Fan Xian was dumbfounded. The internal court newspaper was known as the most useless thing in the Qing kingdom. It was personally written by the scholar and great calligrapher, Sir Pan Ling, and sent to various provinces and counties. It was only kept by the yamen and nobles. If it was on the market, a page of the internal court newspaper would often sell for a great deal of silver. When he was in Danzhou, he had once stolen the newspaper from the old manor to exchange for silver to spend, so he was very familiar with the newspaper. At that time, he had been very disdainful of the gossip content in the so-called newspaper and was very confused about the flowers drawn on the sides of the newspaper. The answer to all of this was, back then, his mother wanted to read gossipy newspapers and listen to interesting news. Fan Xian looked at the emperor with a strange expression and forcefully suppressed the words he was about to blurt out. He had wanted to remind the emperor that the so-called interesting news did not refer to drawing a few flowers on the sides of the newspaper. The emperor did not notice his expression. He spoke more and more happily. "Your mother was most curious about Pingping's story. In the 4th year of the Qing calendar, I took advantage of that old dog's visit to his hometown to have the internal court newspaper write about it. If your mother could see it, presumably, she would be very happy." Fan Xian laughed loudly. He also remembered this story. In the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar, he had traveled from Danzhou to Jingdou. At the time, the two biggest things in Jingdou were the exposure of Prime Minister Lin Ruofu's illegitimate daughter and the marriage alliance with the Fan family. The second was that the internal court editors were not afraid of the power of the Overwatch Council and greatly exposed the youthful story of the director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping. The sun gradually rose by the seaside. It moved from in front of him to behind him, casting the emperor and Fan Xian's shadows on the occasionally rising and falling surface of the sea. The sea water also joined in, making the waves clear and gradually calming. It made the blurry shadows of the two people become clearer and clearer. Fan Xian smiled and lowered his head. He thought, in the end, the emperor was immortal. Just as he could not forget the Qing temple, the emperor could not forget Danzhou. Probably in this life, only on the Danzhou dock would the emperor say so many things. It was precisely this conversation that was not between ruler and official that made Fan Xian have a slightly more favorable impression of the emperor and a deeper understanding of him. At the same time, it also added more worries. He sighed and turned his gaze toward the sea. The worries in his heart were, in the end, a matter for the future. The worries in front of him were already terrifying enough. "What are you worried about?" The emperor's mood was relatively relaxed, and he casually asked. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "The admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy is a disciple of the Qin family." No one knew how large a guard of honor was needed for the emperor to officially go on an inspection tour. Even though the Qing emperor was known for his plain clothes, the court had put a great deal of effort into defense. On land, the provincial soldiers were outside, the imperial army was inside, and there was a group of aces and that strange old creature, Eunuch Hong. It could be called a steel fortress. On the water, a few warships of the Jiaozhou Navy had also received an edict and arrived. They were responsible for guarding against dangers from the sea. As Fan Xian said these words, his eyes were slightly narrowed as he stared at the surface of the sea, at the ships the Jiaozhou Navy had sent to protect the emperor. The emperor's expression was calm. It was as if he did not take Fan Xian's reminder to heart. he said, "there will come a day when I will seek justice for you for the matter of the valley. However, General Qin is the cornerstone of the country, so there is no need to doubt him. Since you have already moved the Black Knights over, there is no need to worry about an attack within 100 li. Why do you have to be restless all day like a stray dog?" Chapter 521. I wish everyone a happy Dragon Boat Festival. Eat more rice dumplings, don't be rice dumplings. There will be a new ticket on Monday, but I still haven't figured out how to do it. Everyone play for a while. I'll watch for a while. The next day, the group left Danzhou at the first glimmer of dawn. Since it was the Emperor's entourage, the formation was naturally not ordinary. Although all kinds of ceremonial guards had yet to come out, there was a procession of nearly 3 miles in front and behind. The densely packed crowd surrounded the large carriage in the middle that was full of noble air. It looked astonishing. The people of Danzhou knelt on the ground and respectfully kowtowed to the departing emperor. Perhaps this was their first and only chance to see the emperor in this life. As a citizen of the Qin kingdom, no one wanted to miss it. Fan Xian rode at the back of the group. With a worried expression, he looked at the group walking on the road in the distance. He was about to follow the emperor to the great Dong Mountain Temple to worship heaven. His heart was filled with unease and confusion. Last night, he had met privately with Ren Shaoan. Only then did he know that the emperor had chosen Dong Mountain to worship heaven, not only because the emperor had begun to miss the air of freedom, their past meeting, and Danzhou's sea breeze. Rather, it was because the original plan to worship heaven in the Qin temple in Jingdou had run into difficulties. What difficulties? No one in the Qin temple in Jingdou had the right to host such a large worship ceremony. This was truly a ridiculous reason. The Qin kingdom had always believed in swords and weapons. Although they respected ghosts and gods, they kept their distance. Particularly under the emperor's influence, the power of the ascetic monks in the temple grew weaker by the day. The orthodox Tianidao, led by northern Qi Kuhi, was unable to enter the Qin kingdom's temple system. Meanwhile, the few remaining high priests of virtue and prestige had met with problems one after another in the past few years. First, after the great priest returned to the capital from the southern wastelands, he died of old age and illness in less than a month. The second priest, Great Master Sanshi, died tragically in the woods on the outskirts of Jingdou. Fan Xian could faintly guess that the death of the great priest in the Qin temple had been secretly done by the emperor. However, if they wanted to worship heaven, they could actually go to Dong Mountain. After all, it was known as the place in the world most similar to the temple. It was the most mysterious place and the place with the most incense. But was it only because of such an absurd reason? Fan Xian squeezed his horse's belly and followed the group with a frown. His Majesty's protection work was carried out in an orderly manner, so he did not need to worry too much. Especially when he saw the hundreds of tiger guards with long sabers sandwiched in the imperial army, he felt even more reassured. 7 tiger guards could rival Haitang Duo. What kind of concept was 100 tiger guards? He should be at ease, but he was still worried. In many people's minds, Fan Xian was probably an expert at scheming and scheming. He knew that his scheming could not be considered very powerful. In the past, he had been able to win every battle in the Qin kingdom and northern Qi because he had Yan Bingyun's help and Chen Pingping's care. Most importantly, his biggest backer was the emperor. With him as a backer, he could break through any mountain he came across. He had nothing to be truly afraid of. But if the target of a conspiracy was his backer, Fan Xian knew that he did not have enough intelligence to deal with such a big scene. He saw himself very clearly, so he was particularly careful and sensitive. Thinking of the question that had been lingering in his heart since yesterday, he felt a sliver of caution. The emperor going out on patrol was a major event. Even if he had been floating on the sea at the time and cut off his intelligence network with the Overwatch Council, Yen Bingyun, who was in charge of Jingdo Council affairs, would certainly have a way to notify him. The internal communications of the Qinian unit had always been open. Why didn't Yen Bingyun notify him ahead of time? He summoned Wang Qinian and asked a few questions. When he received a report from the council that everything was as usual, he couldn't help but scratch his head. He didn't say anything more and smiled self-mockingly. He felt that he was too suspicious and a bit morbid. Traveling by land, it only took a few days before he saw the lonely mountain by the sea that had blocked the sea breeze for tens of thousands of years and the sunrise in the east. It stood alone and stubbornly pierced into the sky like half a piece of jade. Fan Xian rode beside the emperor's carriage and unconsciously put up a shade. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the large mountain and sighed in admiration. This was the third time he had seen the great Dong Mountain by the sea. Each time he saw it, he couldn't help but sigh at the wonders of nature. How could such a magnificent sight not open one's mind? After sighing, Fan Xian also felt some pity and anger. He had lived in Danzhou for 16 years, yet he had no idea that there was such a holy land not far from his hometown. Otherwise, he would certainly have dragged Uncle Wu Zhu here often to play. Although the court had sealed off the excavation of jade on Dong Mountain, it did not prohibit the common people from entering the temple to pray. If Fan Xian had often come to play, presumably no one would have stopped him. However, if he was still a child, it would not be so easy for him to enter Dong Mountain today. Flags fluttered at the foot of the mountain. Thousands of people stood in line and completely sealed off the path into the mountain. 3 days ago, the imperial edict had already been sent to Dong Mountain. The priests and monks of the temple on the mountain were respectfully waiting for the emperor's arrival at the mountain gate. The common people who had come up to burn incense had long been chased down the mountain by the local provincial soldiers. On this lonely mountain, thousands of people were silent. An oppressive and strict atmosphere enveloped the surroundings. All of this was for one person, the foremost person in the world. Eunuch Yao stepped onto the wooden frame and helped the emperor, dressed in formal clothing and bright yellow, out of the carriage. The emperor stood on the platform in front of the carriage. Without anyone's command, the thousands of people at the foot of the mountain knelt down in unison and shouted, "Long live the emperor!" The emperor waved his hand with a calm expression, indicating for everyone to rise. After being helped out of the carriage by Eunuch Yao, he naturally left the eunuch's hand. With his hands behind his back, he walked toward the newly repaired mountain gate, which glowed with white jade. Eunuch Hong followed behind the emperor. Fan Xian took a few more steps back and calmly observed the situation. Walking to the foot of the mountain gate, the priests wearing robes bowed respectfully to the emperor again. They then bent their bodies in a fawning manner and invited the emperor to ascend to listen to the heavenly edict. Fan Xian watched this scene and laughed to himself in his heart. The monks of the Qing kingdom indeed did not have as much status as those in northern Qi. The emperor did not immediately move. Looking at the magnificent mountain gate, he smiled warmly and said, "The first edict came a month ago. The exact time of my arrival was set 3 days ago." The temple's reaction was fast. However, don't disturb the people too much. If a mountain gate is so magnificent, be careful that Dongshan Road doesn't have any silver. The priest's expressions became awkward. The head priest of Dongshan Temple explained in a trembling voice, "Your Majesty, it is only a mountain gate. The temple on the peak is the same as it was 20 years ago. It has not changed at all." The emperor smiled slightly and said, "That is good." Governor He Yongji, who had rushed over to the side to wait on the emperor, wiped the sweat from his forehead. He thought to himself that his flattery had backfired. Fortunately, the emperor's latter words had been gentle. The emperor glanced at the governor and furrowed his brows. "Didn't I tell you not to come in the letter I sent you?" Governor He Yongji was one of the governors of the Seven Roads. Although his position was slightly lower than Xueqing's, he could still be considered a first-rank official. In front of the emperor, he did not have any of the air of a major figure. He smiled bitterly and said, "It is rare for your majesty to leave the capital, and you have come to Dongshan Road. I and the officials of the roads feel honored. How could I not come to wait on you?" It was clear that the governors of the Seven Roads were the Qing Emperor's most trusted officials. The emperor smiled and scolded, "Get back to your Luozhou. The governor leads an army. Just do your job well. When have I ever lacked people to wait on me?" He glanced at Fan Xian behind him and said, with Commissioner Fan following, "You can go back." He Yongji did not dare to object. He knew that although the emperor appeared warm, he never went back on his word. He did not tarry. He knelt down again and kowtowed. He nodded at Fan Xian as a greeting and then hurriedly led his people back to Luozhou, where the governor's manor was. Fan Xian watched with a slight smile and did not say a word. The Great Dong Mountain was very tall. Using Fan Xian's measurements, it was at least 2,000 meters. Around the mountain, other than the sea, there were plains. The contrast made the mountain appear even more abrupt and towering into the sky. If one wanted to climb it, no one would not feel a chill in their hearts. Fortunately, the side of Dong Mountain facing the sea was an incomparably smooth jade wall. The side facing the land was the accumulation of millions of years of life from the soil. On both sides of the stone steps, green grass grew. Tall trees rose into the sky. Their branches and leaves were like little green fans that blocked out the first rays of the summer sun. They danced gently in the mountain wind like countless little fans, bringing a trace of coolness to the people walking on it. Perhaps it was such a quiet and beautiful scenery that gave the common people who came up the mountain to burn incense the courage to walk the seemingly endless stone steps. Thousands of imperial soldiers stood guard at the foot of Dong Mountain. Following the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven were old eunuch Hong, Fan Xian, the minister of the Board of Rites, and a group of officials. There were also a number of eunuchs accompanying him. Over 100 tiger guards were also vigilantly scattered around the emperor. However, they did not walk the stone step. Instead, they walked the small mountain paths, which were a bit more difficult. The tens of thousands of stone steps truly tested one's willpower and energy. The common people called these long stone steps the stairway to heaven. Only by climbing it could one appear sincere and use the miraculous effects of the temple in Dong Mountain to cure illnesses. However, this trip was not for the common people to pray to God. The tiger guards walking between the stones could still hold on. Even the eunuchs seemed to have energy to spare. However, the minister of the Board of Rites, Ren Shao, and the other civil officials could not hold on much longer. They couldn't care less about losing face in front of the emperor. Each of them held their waists and panted. Fan Xian had climbed mountains and jumped cliffs since he was a child. These tens of thousands of stone steps were nothing to him. He didn't even pant. He watched these people and found that the eunuchs beside the emperor were able to move so easily. He couldn't help but be speechless. Eunuch Hong was a strange creature. He knew that Eunuch Yao knew martial arts, but even the eunuchs serving tea were skilled. He couldn't help but feel that there were indeed crouching tigers and hidden dragons at the emperor's side. After an indeterminable amount of time, the group of people finally reached the summit. Including a few priests and civil officials, they all collapsed weakly to the ground and couldn't come to their senses for a moment. The emperor glanced at these people mockingly but couldn't be bothered to scold them. Alone, with his sleeves behind his back, he walked to the edge of the cliff at the summit of Dong Mountain. Looking at the floating clouds in front of the cliff and the sun diagonally above, his expression was incomparably calm and joyous. It was as if he had finally achieved, or was about to achieve, a goal. Fan Xian followed behind him and smiled slightly. He saw the emperor's chest rise and fall slightly. His face was slightly red and moist with sweat. It seemed that although the emperor's body was strong, he was no longer the young man who rode into battle. It was only for the sake of the emperor's face that he forcefully endured it. After resting for a moment, the people accompanying them began to arrange the ceremony and the troublesome food and lodging arrangements. The emperor and Fan Xian were still standing at the edge of the cliff. The father and son seemed to be attracted by the wondrous scene at the foot of Dong Mountain. They didn't say a word and only stared in a daze in front of them. In front of them was the ocean, a boundless ocean. However, the ocean they saw from here was different from the ocean they saw from the Danzhou dock. The ocean in Danzhou was close yet not easy to get close to. Rising and falling, it was close to their feet. The sound was by their ears, and white foam soaked the bottom of their pant. The ocean at the foot of Dong Mountain was distant and cold. Standing at the edge of the cliff, it was impossible to hear the roar of the wave. Gazing along the jade-like mountain walls, one could only see white lines advancing wave after wave on the ocean, crashing against the stone walls of Dong Mountain and soaking the foot of the mountain, doing an eternally useless task. In front of the cliff were layers of thin and light clouds. They were like white paper, slowly flowing high and low between the cliff. The red sun had long risen above the ocean, but it didn't seem to be much higher than the great Dong Mountain. Standing on the mountain, the sun seemed particularly close. The light passed through the white clouds and glowed with twisted and beautiful lines. Gradually, it made the pure white clouds even fainter until they almost disappeared into the air. Watch the clouds disappear and disperse, watch the rise and fall of the tide. Fan Xian unconsciously rubbed his nose and smiled self-mockingly. Why did he have to stand here by the emperor's side? Then, he saw the emperor's body sway. Fan Xian was shocked. Like lightning, he stretched out his hand. His left hand opened like a cattail leaf. His fingers bent slightly and exerted force. In an instant, the coffin breaker technique was unleashed. In a flash, he grabbed the emperor's hand and pulled him back a step. Below the two of them was a bottomless abyss. If they fell in, how could they survive? After Fan Xian's heart palpitated, he realized he had been rash. He apologized and greeted the emperor. He then noticed old eunuch Hong behind him glancing at him with a strange gaze. The emperor gently rubbed his forehead. He was not angry. On the contrary, he said self-mockingly, "Looks like I am indeed old. After looking for a long time, I feel a bit dizzy." You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.